Dead Space released on the 14th of October 2008 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Developed by Visceral Games and published by EA, Dead Space was a breath of fresh air into the damaged, and to be honest, mostly forgotten about survival horror genre at this time. If it didn't have RE or SH in the title, it didn't seem to make a splash. But then, out of nowhere, EA, of all publishers, announces a move completely out of left field, changing the survival horror landscape forever. Dead Space connected both with critics and the public, selling approximately 2 million copies and scoring a Metacritic of 88. Now just for context, the only other survival horror scoring higher than this across the entire 7th generation of consoles is Dead Space 2, which came in 1 point higher. Now my history with this title is a bit strange. My favourite genre of media is science fiction. I adore survival horror, and yet I didn't pick up Dead Space till nearly 2 years after its launch. I ended up grabbing it second hand for £5 from the pre-owned section of Game, and then when I started it, I was shitting my pants so much I took an extended break which went on for 6 months before I finally plucked up the courage to revisit it. But when I finally took my dummy out, put my big boy pants on, and manned the fuck up, I was hooked, going on to earn the Platinum Trophy shortly thereafter. Dead Space is a franchise I adore, and with the remake on the horizon, it seems like a perfect opportunity to revisit the series, to see if it still holds up all these years later. Now it's been 12 years since I last played it, and so, over the course of this review, I'll be explaining what works, what doesn't, and ultimately, if it even needs a remake. Now for those of you who've never played Dead Space before, I will be going through spoilers, but I'll provide timestamps to help you avoid them. Now let's dive in. The year is 2508. In the quest for resources to sustain a growing population, man looked out to the stars for answers, and in the great abyss of space, we found salvation. The CEC, an Earth-based megacorporation, created a vessel capable of planet cracking, a large-scale mining operation to extract the materials we need from other planets and return them to Earth. The ship that pulled us back from the brink of extinction was the USG Ishimura, the first planet cracker. It's completed 34 successful missions and symbolizes humanity's will to survive no matter the odds. But the odds have become stacked against them. While mining Aegis 7, the USG Ishimura sends a distress signal, and the USG Kellion is sent to investigate. Our story begins with the crew of the Kellion, which is made up of Senior Security Officer Zach Hammond, Technologist Kendra Daniels, and Engineer Isaac Clarke. Now after a dodgy landing, they arrive at the Ishimura and soon realise that things are much worse than they ever anticipated. The crew of the Ishimura are missing, and in their place are the stuff of nightmares. Necromorphs, formed from the corpses of the dead, they soon overwhelm the crew of the Kellion, forcing Daniels, Hammond and Isaac to flee. In a moment of safety, they vow to find out what caused this disaster and how to survive. Dead Space sees us play as Isaac Clarke. As an engineer, he is perfectly suited to fixing the damage across the Ishimura to try and delay the impending threats which are approaching from all sides. Generally, each chapter begins with a video conversation with either Daniels or Hammond, instructing Isaac on which part of the ship is malfunctioning, and it's your job to go and fix it. From the life support to an asteroid defense system, it turns out the Ishimura is a goddamn write-off. You travel from one part of the ship to the other, collect or move a few pieces to repair it, and then go on to the next. By the time I got to the midpoint, I'd become fully expectant that no matter what the objective is, it's always way worse than it sounds on paper. Oh, we need to switch on the communications? No problem, I'll get right on it. Oh, Isaac, looks like you need 3 separate cards scattered across the ship to open the door to get to it. Oh, and Isaac, you'll need to place a beacon on an asteroid and push that out into space so we can get a signal. Oh, and Isaac? Yeah? Can you put a broom up your arse and sweep the floor as you go? Now, if this was all there was, the plot of Dead Space would be good, but not all that memorable. Fortunately, this isn't even the tip of the iceberg. Dead Space incorporates a similar design philosophy as the 2007 masterpiece BioShock. While exploring the environment, you'll come across text documents, audio diaries, and video logs. These pickups are sensational. What starts as a story about fixing a ship becomes a story about religion, government control, and the shady dealings of a megacorporation, with plenty of room left to expand upon these in future sequels. With each document I collected, I became more and more enraptured by the players within this world, with their ideologies, and how all of it is not only relevant, but essential to understanding what caused the events to transpire aboard the Ishimura. Earlier, I made the comparison with BioShock, and nowhere is this more prevalent than in the environmental storytelling. Every wall and every corridor is bursting with character, with stories to tell. They make the world feel believable, and in seeing the state of the scenery and the bodies that litter the environment, your imagination is ignited by the sheer horror of it all. When I think about the survival horror genre, outside of a few notable exceptions, the plot is typically not the strong suit. They do enough to carry the game from one set piece to another, but don't rely on providing a strong narrative experience that you'd expect from other genres in gaming. Here, in Dead Space, is an exception to that rule. The plot weaves multiple threads together, from Isaac's search for his girlfriend Nicole, who is stationed on the Ishimura, to the secrets of the marker itself, and backs this up with enough twists and turns to make you think you're watching an M. Night movie. One of the good ones anyway. Now, speaking of twists, I'm going to move this over to spoilers just for the moment, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the timestamp shown above. Now I'll give you a few moments to make a quick escape. Across the game, Isaac has video conversations with his girlfriend Nicole. She constantly bangs on about making us whole, and as much as he'd want to fill that hole, it was setting off major warning signs for me as I played through for the first time. When I got to the finale of the game and realised Nicole had been dead the entire time, it was a real gut punch. The realisation that the marker is having a tangible effect on Isaac's psyche, that he's a few hours away from giving a wall a Glasgow kiss, is a frightening prospect. Speaking of frightening, fuck that jump scare right at the end. You've escaped the nightmare, it's over, and then in a moment of silence, Nicole just pipes up. During this playthrough, I remembered a good portion of the game, but I was able to experience one twist which I'd completely forgotten about. Kendra Daniels. What a scumbag. I spent the entire game trusting her, and then boom, what you say? My jaw was on the floor. I've never been so happy to forget something. The shock reminded me on how effective these twists had been for the first time. I've been extremely positive this entire section, but there's one negative. Isaac is mute. Now, for the vast majority of the game, it isn't even a factor, but as soon as you have an emotional beat, the flaw in this approach raises its head. Take the revelation that Nicole is dead. All you get is silence, and then a unique animation of Isaac shaking his head like the Churchill dog, which lasts for like 15 frames, and then he's back to normal. For all I know, he's thinking about the juicy life insurance payout he's about to receive. And that moment just took me right out of the experience. Spoilers are over, so let's bring this section to a close. The plot of Dead Space is an overwhelming success. Isaac Clarke is a vessel for us to experience the story, but don't be fooled. He isn't the star of Dead Space. The draw here is the Ishimura and the crew that inhabit her. Dead Space is a game which creates a world that I want to learn more about. And for any new IP, that is the ultimate goal. Reducing Isaac to a silent protagonist does hurt the emotional weight the game could convey, but it doesn't reduce the impact the Ishimura leaves on you, long after the journey ends. Take a sprinkle of classic sci-fi horror, add a dash of System Shock, a shot of classic survival horror, and top it off with RE4. and you've got the mix for Dead Space. Taking inspiration from the greats of old is one thing, but how do you combine these disparate parts into a cohesive experience? Well, first, you need great enemies which are both fun and terrifying to engage with, and then you layer this with systems that underpin every action on screen. Dead Space introduces us to the necromorphs, disgusting, grotesque creatures in their own right, but how you deal with them is pure genius. With most games, you'll be expected to aim center of mass, or if you're feeling extra spicy, go for the headshot for extra damage. Here, doing this is nothing short of a waste of ammo. To take these guys down quickly, you'll need to dismember them. To help with this task, Isaac is armed to the teeth with an assortment of weapons. Now, as an engineer, the vast majority of these are tools of the trade. The plasma cutter, the line gun, the ripper, and many more. You can see their intended purpose within their design, and as it happens, engineer and surgeon must be part of the same job family, as these tools do more than enough to cut down wave after wave of necromorphs. And trust me, over this journey, you'll be mowing down hundreds of enemies. The game at times feels like an action game in how large the groups can get and how powerful your weapons feel. It only takes a few rounds to deal with almost any threat. So I suppose it's most like RE4 in that way. However, one big change between the two is how tricky these bastards can be. One minute, you're engaging a threat from across the room, and the next, they've burst through the vents above and behind you, forcing you to run and try and create some space while they sprint after you with ferocious speed. Now, what helps keep the experience fresh throughout is the frequency to which you're exposed to new types of necromorph. The moment you found the right tool for the job, a new challenger approaches and makes you go back to the drawing board. Every weapon has a primary and an alt firing type, and they each have their uses. Now, in my original playthrough, I bought every weapon and tried them all out to see which I preferred, but on this run, I knew exactly what I needed to get the job done. A plasma cutter with its alt fire changing from horizontal to vertical slices makes it adaptable to any threat. The Ripper, for dealing with the swarmers and other small threats without wasting a shit ton of ammo. The Contact Gun, for obliterating bigger targets, getting them off the field as quick as possible. And finally, the head honcho, the Pulse Rifle. The only gun that isn't an industrial tool, and in my opinion, the best gun in the game. It fires a ridiculous amount of ammo, and it causes the enemies to essentially be stun locked, meaning if you're being rushed by a group, you can spray till your heart's content without a worry. Now, that's not to say the other weapons aren't useful. The line gun in particular has an incredible alternate fire, which allows you to take out multiple threats as you reposition, and with its massive hitbox on its primary attack, you can destroy multiple limbs in one hit. I suppose it all comes down to personal preference, but my combo took me through impossible when I played it all those years ago, and I'm not one to throw away a winning strategy. Speaking of strategy, the Stomp. Early into the experience, you'll encounter infectors, ray-like creatures that turn any corpse into an enhanced necromorph. From the moment you meet these, vents and dead bodies become a terrifying concept.
Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you? We have some work to do now.
After getting caught out time and time again in my original playthrough, it became ingrained in me to take matters into my own hands to reduce the risk further down the road. At the end of the day, you can't infect that which is already destroyed. Weapons and feet are two pieces of the puzzle to deal with the necros, but they aren't everything. The game gives you two additional tools, stasis and kinesis. Stasis throws out a ball of energy which slows anything it touches. Late in the game, super fast necros called twitches appear, and without stasis to hand, you're asking to get bodied. It gives you the choice to slow down bigger threats and deal with the fodder before circling back for the killing blow. Kinesis, on the other hand, gives me everything I ever wanted in real life: telekinesis. With it, you can move objects in the environment, pick up exploding canisters, and even rip off enemy claws to throw at a new target. Both of these abilities are used in the combat and in the puzzles. In my mind, puzzles are a key component to survival horror, and here in Dead Space, they do appear, but they aren't as integral to the experience as I would like, only really being used to fix components around the Ishimura in comically easy fashion. The reason for their lack of complexity is down to pacing. Dead Space is a masterful example of how you keep the action coming, but keep the tension at record heights. Vents are everywhere in the game. You know a necro is going to pop out of one of them, but as it's procedural, it's anyone's guess, and that keeps you on your toes. Now, when I play survival horror, I typically take a breather when the action dies down, take a quick chug of water and recompose myself before cracking on with the horror at hand. But in Dead Space, I must have spat out my drink at least twice a play session. Relaxation is not on the cards here, and when you combine this with an in-game inventory which operates in real time and a waypoint system to guide you onto the next objective, eliminating the need to check the map, you barrel forwards from one threat to the next. When you think about classic Resident Evil, it's essentially a Metroidvania in how you need to locate items to get past objectives, and with new items, it opens opportunity to explore, relying on backtracking and decision-based item conservation, and in these decisions is where the tension comes into play. Dead Space doesn't do this. It provides you with all the tools you need to get from one place to the next, and instead relies on jump scares and atmosphere to keep the horror set to maximum. Now, if this was all there was, no matter how enjoyable the experience, it would soon become dull. This is where Dead Space turns to its space setting. At various points on your adventure, you'll enter zero-G areas or sections without an atmosphere, and each of these provide their own challenges. Without an atmosphere, you're managing your air supply, and when the timer hits 0, it's game over. And when you factor in that sound doesn't travel in a vacuum, it becomes eerie as hell. All you can hear is the muted sound of your gun and Isaac's gasp for breath, and you know it's effective when even a couple of fodder enemies can cause paranoia. The zero-G areas aren't just an excuse to sit in awe at the visuals on screen, they provide opportunities for a tweak to the gameplay. The lack of gravity opens itself up to traversal puzzles, and with how intuitive it is to control, it never feels cumbersome. So at this point, we've covered the enemies, combat, and general pacing, but there's one final piece to this puzzle which ties it all together: the in-game economy. Killing enemies gives you rewards, be that ammunition, health kits, or credits. Now you may be thinking, I've seen this system before. And you're right, it's very reminiscent of that. The difference is, here, it's all about the sale of resources to buy upgrades. Found mostly at the start of the level, the store allows you to buy items which have been found around the environment. Now these schematics cover everything from suit upgrades to health kits, ammo, and even new weapons. Isaac has a limited inventory. Enemies drop a shit ton of resources, and that inventory will soon fill up. It means you'll never have to worry about a lack of ammo or health kits. And as the store allows you to move items from your inventory to storage, you can always run back and grab something from the stash if it gets a bit hectic. But if you want to upgrade your equipment or buy a new suit, this is where the choice comes in. Nodes are found across the environment in limited quantities, but most of the time you'll be buying these for 10,000 credits at the store. These nodes are used to increase your weapon damage, reduce reload speed, and upgrade every element of Isaac's suit. The difference between a base weapon and its fully upgraded counterpart are worlds apart, and so the race to upgrade to stay one step ahead of the ever-increasing threat begins. Now, as I stated, you'll have far more resource than you ever need, and you could squirrel this away for later use, or you can sell it off to be able to buy more nodes and get upgrading as quick as possible. Now, on the normal difficulty, there's the odd occasion you may wonder why you sunk so much into a gun that now you're no longer using when you're desperately low on credits and health kits, but for the most part, any mistake is easily rectified by the sale of ammunition, which is in abundance on this difficulty. In harder modes, the balancing act between upgrades and lack of resources becomes much more apparent, and this is where the system truly shows its worth. If we tie all those parts together, we have a game that is paced for maximum speed and tension, enemies which demand you to find strategies to deal with them, and weapons which need to be upgraded to keep up with the challenges at hand. It takes what was laid down before and improves on many of the systems in those influences, while creating scenes of horror that are reminiscent of the sci-fi greats of old. Now unfortunately, it's not all rosy. There's a few sour spots, and they really stick out and show its age. First up, Kinesis. Now don't get me wrong, it's used great in puzzles and throwing the odd gas canister, but when it comes to throwing enemy body parts and necromorphs, it feels like you're doing it just to piss them off, just to add a bit of insult before you switch back to the plasma cutter. It doesn't help too that the aiming of this seems all over the place. You'll go for a body part, and instead you'll pick up a crate or some other random shit dotted around the environment. It was more of a threat to myself than anyone else, and I quickly avoided using it outside of where it's necessary. The lifts. Fucking hell's a shit ton of lifts. This period in gaming was all about masking loading times, and for some reason, everyone thought putting you in a small box for eternity was the correct way to go about it. Now you have the odd exception where this is flipped on its head, and you're jumped by enemies or a necro appears directly as the lift doors open, making you cack your pants. But for the most part, you just sit there and check your phone for a minute. It turns out, in the 26th century, everything is advanced, except for lift technology. My final bugbear is one that, if you've played the game, you'll be expecting this. The asteroid defense sections. What were they thinking? A break in the gameplay is great, as I've already explained, but chucking in random sections which play like a budget shooter, and on the harder difficulties become the hardest part of the game, is a nightmare. They aren't fun, they go on for ages, and it's the only part of the experience that feels tacked on. Games need to know what they are, and for as much as I appreciate the choice to spice it up, it's executed so poorly that it begs belief why they didn't just save the time and create another boss fight. Fortunately, it's only used twice across the game, but even then, that's 2 times too many. Now, don't get me wrong, the positives here outweigh the negatives by a country mile, but in the sense of fairness, I thought they were worth mentioning. Now let's move it on to the presentation. I'm not overstating this when I say Dead Space is the master of presentation. Everything you need to know is communicated to the player without compromising on screen real estate. Modern video gaming is a mess of HUDs, button prompts, and icons. Dead Space uses its 26th century aesthetic to provide the characters with the resource integration gear, meaning they can incorporate every element you need to know, from the health to the ammo counter, into the suit itself. Diegetic design is so much harder to do than simply splashing a HUD on screen and calling it a day. To be able to show each character's health state from the bar on their spine, to be able to monitor your stasis from a dial on the shoulder, it removes the suspension of disbelief that normally comes with playing a video game, and enables complete immersion into the world. This immersion is doubled down on with incredible lighting and sound design. Now I've already covered how atmospheric this game is, but it's worth mentioning again just how excellent the use of fixed light sources are. Generally, an area is lit from a few static light sources, be that billboards, lights behind fans, and bar lights, with the rest of it left to your weapon and suit. While walking down blood-soaked corridors, lights will flicker and turn off. And when you add this onto the amazing sound design which shows the weight of Isaac's steps, the screeches of the necromorphs, and the silence of space, you can't help but be completely absorbed into the experience. Performance-wise, it's a knockout too. Every character puts in a great showing, and as these conversations are done via video logs, it means the quality in mocap can be shown off without having to pull you into a full-on cutscene. It's impeccable. Musically, Dead Space reminds me so much of the wonder and dread that movies like Alien and Event Horizon elicit. When it needs to, it's slow and building, relying on synth and strings, and then ramps to blood-pumping pace, incorporating scratching strings and thumping bass when the action demands it. Jason Graves poured his heart and soul into the soundtrack, and it truly delivers. Now, it goes without saying here, the most iconic track from this game is this.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
First shown to us in its initial trailers, there's something frightening about kids' songs. I don't know what it is, but whenever horror goes to this place, it never fails to scare the living piss out of me. Am I scared of kids? No, just of kids' songs apparently. My son is about to start school this year, and I'm already faced with the possibility that I might not be able to last an entire Christmas concert without stomping on some kid out of pure primal fear. Now, when it came time to revisit Dead Space, I wanted to recapture my experience as close as possible to my original playthrough. So, I played and captured the gameplay from the PlayStation 3. Performance-wise, the game runs at 720p at 30 FPS. It didn't take long to adjust the resolution, and to be honest, it looked great throughout. The frame rate, though, was another matter. As soon as you get a host of enemies on screen, and you pull out a pulse rifle, the frame rate drops substantially, leading to crazy amounts of lag. It only happened a couple of times across the game, but when it did, it pulled me right out of the experience. Now, I'm not a PC Chad, and I don't own an Xbox, so if you have those options, they will be the best way to play the game in modern times. But as it's not available on PS4 or PS5 right now, and that's where I enjoy playing my games, I'm sticking with my trusty old PS3, even if these days it sounds like it's about to go into orbit.
Back with that buckaroos!
To end this section, I'm going to talk about bosses, and there will be spoilers here, so skip ahead to the timestamp shown if you're avoiding them. Across the game, you'll encounter a host of mini-bosses which are there to introduce new enemy types. But there's 3 actual bosses. The Hunter. Did you like the Regenerator in RE4? Yeah? Good. He's back. And he's a dickhead. Now, I mean that in the best kind of way. He's a pain in the arse to deal with, specially designed by Dr. Mercer to waste your ammo. You encounter him in Chapter 5, and then later in Chapter 10. Now, on the first encounter, he's there to up the anxiety, to put a fire under your arse as you move around the chapter, culminating in a combat encounter where you have to deal with a horde of necromorphs before freezing him in a cryopod. Next, in Chapter 10, it's the same dance, but this time you have harder enemies, a greater mix of them, and you need to burn him to finally put him down. For me, the Hunter is the evolution of the Regenerator in RE4. It's not an original idea, but using him as a force you can't kill, while combating several other threats, means you need to utilize stasis efficiently, and as the pressure is on, mistakes will be made. It's one of the only times I had to go into the menu in the middle of combat, which made me feel incredibly vulnerable. These 2 encounters with the Hunter were simply incredible. The other 2 bosses in the Hive Mind and the Leviathan are full of scale, but lacking in substance. The Leviathan is set in 0 gravity, and that gives you the ability to move around the environment to deal with him, but I just strafed a bit and it was all over. And the Hive Mind is even more basic. He telegraphs attacks so clearly, you can just move left or right continuously and fire into his yellow pustules, and that's it. These 2 encounters reminded me that I was playing a video game. They felt unfulfilling, unchallenging, and overall, bland. So in summary, for those that are keeping this spoiler free, it's a mixed bag when it comes to the bosses. There isn't many, and those that appear are either fantastically designed to keep you on your toes, or so unchallenging they fail to create any sense of struggle for our hero. Dead Space is an example of what happens when fans of the survival horror genre get a chance to make an IP they care about, to take their passion for sci-fi horror cinema and fuse it with RE4, System Shock, and many others, molding it into a unique experience you won't get anywhere else. The world, characters and ideologies presented to us are incredibly deep, and they leave themselves open for further mining in the franchise that was to come. The gameplay, while dated in several areas, especially the quest design, holds up very well, and when you combine this with a presentation that is so well thought out, it's still held up as a masterclass 14 years later. It goes without saying, Dead Space doesn't need a remake. Anyone at any point could go back to this game and come away incredibly happy with what they've experienced. But in saying this, a remake will give us the chance to see the series return, and as long as fans put their money where their mouth is and support it, we may be able to see the series move from its dormancy to return as a major player in the survival horror space. And that's it for this review. If you've enjoyed it, put a like on it and subscribe for more Dead Space content. If you've played Dead Space, I'd love to hear from you. I try to respond to everyone on my channel, so let me know your thoughts on the game and we can discuss it. Up next, I'll be moving through the rest of the Dead Space series with Dead Space Extraction. I look forward to seeing you back here soon. Now, if you still want more from me, consider checking out my podcast In PS We Trust. It's a PlayStation podcast where me and my co-host discuss the latest news, rumours and hype for all things survival horror and PlayStation. I'll have links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. We have arrived at Dead Space Extraction. Before we discuss the game, it's important to give you some background. EA, the publisher of Dead Space, was seeking to create the next big thing, the next power franchise, and their strategy for this was an idea called IP Cubed. It essentially boils down to games with a rich story that can be propagated to other forms of media. So before the first games released in October 2008, there had already been a comic which ran from the March of 2008 and culminated with the launch of the game, and then, 7 days after Dead Space's release, there was an animated film which went straight to Blu-ray in Dead Space Downfall. Now this approach is something we see quite a lot of today. Just look at what's on Netflix. You got the Witcher series, Cyberpunk, League of Legends Arcane, HBO are putting out a Last of Us series. These days we don't think much of it, but back in 2008, launching a brand new IP with a whole host of supporting media was something that hadn't really been done before. Now this approach didn't quite hit the mark, as even though Dead Space did exceptionally well with critics and the public, it only sold an estimated 1.86 million copies. Not exactly the powerhouse you'd expect with that amount of push. Now EA aren't ones to give up so easily, and so they looked at the marketplace and noticed they hadn't catered for a particular group of gamers, and this group, they surmised, was starving for mature content on their system. I'm of course talking about the Nintendo Wii. Since its launch in November 2006, the Wii had captured the minds and living rooms of new and old gamers, and by the time Extraction went into development, the Wii was already outselling the PS3 and 360, and by the time the game launched on the 24th of September 2009, it has sold nearly twice as much as the closest competitor. The issue Visceral and co-developer Eurocom faced is how to bring Dead Space, a game which graphically cannot run on the Wii, to the system, and provide an experience that was worth playing. The answer was obvious: an on-rail shooter, and as it would happen, they already had a game they could take learnings from which had released in 2007, Resident Evil's The Umbrella Chronicles. And so, Dead Space Extraction came to be, and it bombed hard. The first week's sales amounted to 9,000 units. The only thing that saved it in the eyes of EA was the critical praise the game received, netting a Metacritic of 82%. As for my experience, much like the first game, which if you haven't seen my review you can find it right here, I came to Extraction late, picking it up as part of the limited edition pre-order of Dead Space 2, where it was bundled in, given a HD lick of paint and made compatible with the Move controller. Now I only played it for 3 or so missions before the urge to dive into the second game became too much, and I never went back. So in 2022, I've completed my first ever playthrough of the game, and during the course of this review, I'll explain why this is the best on-rail shooter I've ever played. As always with my reviews, I'll split this into plot, gameplay and presentation, and it's worth saying, there will be light spoilers, but nothing that would ruin the experience for you. Now let's dive in. Taking place just before the events of Dead Space, and culminating in the arrival of Isaac to the Ishimura, the story in Extraction shows us the devastation brought to the mining colony on Aegis 7, following the unearthing of the marker on the planet. Our story is centered around 4 survivors: Nathan McNeil, a colony detective who we play as for the vast majority of the game; Ishimura soldier Gabe Weller, a colony resident Lexine Murdoch, and CEC Executive of Mining Operations, Warren Eckhart. Beginning on the colony, we see firsthand the effects of the marker on the population. Miners are going insane, and there's a full-scale riot happening all around you. People are massacring each other. Ships are crashing down. It's insane. And that's before the necromorphs show up. The group believe that by leaving the colony, they can find safety on board the in-orbit Ishimura. Little do they know, they're leaving one hellhole for another. The locations you visit across the game are exactly the same as Dead Space, outside of a couple of new areas on the planet's surface. But what makes this compelling is seeing how the colony and the Ishimura are in the shape they are by the time Isaac arrives. The actions your survivors try to take to escape the ship are the reason why it's in such a mess by the time the Kellion arrives. It provides a nice bit of context that I never knew I needed. Now, it's not essential by any means, but I appreciate it. The issue with prequels can be you don't have the opportunity to really grow the world outside of what's already explained to have happened. It gives the game the opportunity to show events that were told to us through file pickups in Dead Space, and this works great. However, when it comes to its own audio logs and files, they basically cover off what was in the base game, but in slimmed down formats. For a Wii owner who never had the opportunity to play Dead Space, it does what it needs to convey the story and the wider lore, but for fans of the first game coming back to this, there isn't anything too meaty to gain from the experience. By the time the game wrapped, I knew as much going in as I did coming out of it, with the only exception to this being the subplot involving Lexine and her supposed immunity to the marker. Now this is mentioned quite late into the game, but it isn't really a major focal point. It comes and goes so quickly, I can't even see this as being a spoiler. It's just foreshadowing for a future story that gets told in the Dead Space 2 DLC. The plot, overall, is carried by revisiting key areas from the first game with a likeable cast of characters, and they each play off each other exceptionally well due to their distinct personalities. Eckhart is a corporate scumbag in the same way that Burke was in Aliens, and seeing him opposite the stoic McNeil and the hot-headed Gabe Weller creates interesting character drama as you play through the experience. And in being a prequel, it gives us an opportunity for a cameo from Isaac's girlfriend Nicole. And all I can say is, I can see exactly why Isaac was willing to put himself through so much shit to save her. Ultimately, the plot is there to drive the player from one shootout to another, and give something for new and old fans of the series to take away from the experience. Personally, I would have appreciated some additional lore to make me see the events of Dead Space in a completely new light. But, with the events of the movie and the comic book, they're kinda stuck in having to stick to what's already out there. Extraction is a nice tie-in story, which does exactly what it needs to do, and really, that's all I can ask for in an on-rail shooter. Extraction brings Dead Space to the on-rail genre in a near perfect transition. So what makes this possible? Well, to put it simply, it knows what a Dead Space game needs to have to root it in that universe, and manages to bring it all over to a new genre. Take weapons. In the base game, every piece of your arsenal has an alt fire type. In Extraction, it's the same thing. Turn the move controller to the side, and not only do you look gangster, you now have access to the alt fire. Super simple to do, and in a motion-based game, it feels kinetic without feeling gimmicky. These alt fire types are taken directly from Dead Space 1. The plasma cutter changes from horizontal to vertical. The force gun throws out force grenades. Now there's a couple of changes, but generally it's incredibly faithful. And as the enemies you face are identical to the base game, it means you can rely on old favourites to get the job done. Now when you enter a stage, you can take 4 guns with you. Now these are found across the environment and can be dropped and refound later with the ammo that you left in them. It gives you a chance to experiment, to try new ones out and not lose any of the ammo reserves and upgrades that you've built up. Ammo isn't a massive deal, just like it wasn't in the base game. You have ample across your entire arsenal, but you can't rely on one single piece to get the job done. You'll need to switch between them fairly regularly to adapt to the challenge presented, and in doing so, you can ensure you don't run too low on one particular weapon. Across the environment, you'll find ammo, guns and upgrades, and these increase the damage or clip size of the gun itself. It pays to pay attention to your surroundings, as the camera doesn't hang around for too long while you move between encounters. Speaking of the camera, if you've seen my Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles video, you'll know how detrimental it can be to a gameplay experience. Here in Extraction, it knows it's an on-rail shooter first, and story game second. Your character is constantly on the move, and it's here that story is delivered. But as soon as a necromorph appears, you are given ample opportunity to line up shots, rooting in place to dispose of the undead scum as quickly as possible. Now I was super worried in the first couple of minutes that this might not be the case, with how quickly the camera seemed to pan between characters while they talked to each other through the environment. But after the first encounter, I knew they'd nailed it. I'm always saying a game needs to remember what it is and stick to it, and that's exactly what Visceral and Eurocom achieved here. When it comes to other hallmarks of the series, you can't forget kinesis, stasis and zero gravity. All of these return. Kinesis is mainly used to collect the ammo and items across the stage, where stasis is used exclusively for combat. Extraction gives you 3 uses of it, which auto-refill with the passage of time. Using this resource wisely by picking your targets, destroying their legs, and then using stasis to refocus on faster threats can make all the difference in a chaotic battle. On the normal difficulty, Extraction is extremely forgiving, but take it up a few notches, and your judgment in using this resource will be tested. The feeling of letting off a stasis blast and hitting nothing but air is a kick right to the ballsack. On the higher difficulties, you can feel your chances of survival disappear before your eyes. So if you're looking for a challenge and a reason to replay, Extraction will go Whalestone Raider on your ass.
Do you want some? I'll give it you.
Finally, the game includes puzzles. That's right. A light gun game provides something that most survival horror games can't even do. Now, I'll set your expectation here. You won't be hunting around for 3 separate keys or pondering over your documents. Extraction basically turns into a game of operation. You need to follow the path outlined with your motion controller with a steady hand, while avoiding obstacles that revert your progress. Now, it sounds really basic, and I suppose it is, but it's often used in conjunction with a flood of enemies coming at you. Now, in co-op, which the game provides via drop-in, drop-out, your partner could cover you to share the load. In solo play, you have AI there, but they're as useful as a sexy nun. And so it's just you, stasis, and a steady hand, and the pressure you experience is incredible. The puzzles aren't deep, but it provides a welcome shake-up to the gameplay whenever they appear. Gimmicks like these are hard to pull off and feel satisfying for long periods of play, but Extraction does it so effortlessly. There's so many little things I could gush about here, from the alternate pathways which encourage replayability outside of difficulty, the Ripper's primary fire being controlled by moving the saw forward and back with the motion of the move controller, to the reload having a sweet spot to get you right back into the action quicker. Every facet of its gameplay sings, and it's a far cry from what we had with the Darkside Chronicles, which put the story it was telling above the gameplay itself. Extraction feels like Umbrella Chronicles, but with more thought, an actual story that's worth telling, and loads of little gameplay features that they couldn't do without motion inputs. I'm honestly blown away by how Extraction plays, and I could go on about it for hours, but I've made my points here, so let's move on to presentation. Extraction originally released on the Wii, and as such, it was limited to a 480p resolution running at 60 FPS. The PS3 version upscales this to 1080p and retains the 60 FPS. Now, I'm glad to report that throughout my entire playthrough, I didn't encounter a single bit of slowdown or frame loss. It ran perfectly. In researching the game, I've noticed threads where the Wii version does encounter slowdown while using the flamethrower against large waves of necromorphs, so that may be something worth considering when choosing to revisit this title. One issue this game has on PS3, and it must be substantially worse under lower resolutions, is the lighting. Dead Space ensured each weapon had a torchlight, which appeared when you take aim. Extraction doesn't do this, instead giving you the option to waggle the controller to light a glowworm. Now, this provides ample light, however, you can't activate it at any point. It's only on selected sections of maps, and it's not exactly clear when you are able to do it. And so for large portions of the game, I was waggling my worm like a kid who's found his first copy of Playboy. It took me far too long to realise the game will prompt when you're able to use it, and I felt a substantial amount of frustration when I realised I'd been waggling for no reason. Everyone loves a good waggle. Everyone loves a good waggle, but waggle too much and you'll go blind. At least that's what I heard. Speaking of blindness, the lighting is incredibly dark. Now, I ended up going into my settings and turning the brightness up several times across the game before finally just going the whole hog and putting it up to max. With the muddiness that comes from sub 720p, I can't imagine how difficult it becomes to see approaching threats. Now, there's two other differences between the versions that may help you choose between them. On the Wii, you have access to bonus materials included on the disc, and this is a motion comic. Now, for the PS3, this option has been removed, and instead, you'll have to navigate the PS3 PSN store and download them from there. Now, if you ever want a horrifying experience, try finding anything on that piece of shit. I swear, it's a form of torture in some POW camps. The final difference is how the game calibrates your motion controller. The Wii has you point at several targets on screen to get accurate calibration, whereas the PS3 gets you to point at the PSI camera. The light blinks a few times, and that's it. It's done. Now for PS3, make sure to put the camera squarely under the TV. If you do that, you'll be fine. But put it anywhere else, and you're asking for issues. It's a small gripe, but one I thought was worth pointing out. Putting the differences aside, Dead Space was a beautiful game both in how it looked and how it sounded. With the environment's character models and sound palette lifted from its older brother, it's no surprise then that Extraction knocks it out of the park on all fronts here. When it comes to performances, outside of one bad audio log found in Chapter 3,
The marker, as the unitologists call it, the Extraction team all went crazy. The brass says it's coincidence, but that's bullshit. Now, half the miners are suffering from some weird dementia, but nobody dares suggest it's because of the artifact. Well, I will, and I don't like where this is going.
No shit.
the main cast truly bring their individual characters to life, and they're excellent. Due to the nature of the game and its quick 6-hour runtime, they don't have the chance to show a huge amount of depth, but what is shown to us is enough to convey the strengths and weaknesses with each character, and you'll soon grow to enjoy each of them for what they bring to the story and to each other. Dead Space Extraction could have been a lazy cash grab title, a game where it recycled everything and added very little, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Extraction successfully brings Dead Space to an on-rail shooter and uses its motion controller features to enhance the experience. The plot may not have been something I needed to experience to understand the world of Dead Space, but it did introduce some intriguing characters which I'm looking forward to rendezvousing with in the Dead Space 2 DLC. Now, if you enjoyed the Resident Evil light gun games in the Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles, you will adore Extraction. It's leagues ahead of those two titles, and for my money, the best on-rail shooter I've ever experienced. Do yourself a favor, dust off the Wii or the PS3, and get ready to waggle that worm. You won't regret it. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it and consider subscribing for more Dead Space reviews. I try to respond to everyone on my channel, so if you've played Extraction or have any questions, reach out and we can discuss it. Up next, I'll be reviewing Dead Space Ignition before I move on to the Resident Evil Village DLC, and I look forward to seeing you back here soon. If you're still looking for a bit more from me, consider checking out my PlayStation podcast, In PS We Trust. It's available right here on YouTube in edited video format, or via Spotify or any podcast service that you use. And that's it for me. Thank you for your time. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. And here we are with Dead Space Ignition, the third entry in the Dead Space series, and one which changes the game completely. Ignition launched on the PS3 and Xbox 360, coming direct to the digital stores on the 12th of October 2010. Now at this time, there were two divisions in gaming, the physical release games and the digital ones, the latter of which were regarded as lesser titles. It was kind of like the difference between a cinema release and a film going direct to DVD. This assumption wasn't always correct, and there are tons of examples of indie games which help change the perception over time, but Ignition was not one of those. Developed by Megatube, Visceral Games, and Sumo Digital, with publishing done by EA, Ignition launched to a less than stellar critical reception.
Wow.
Now that's pretty damning. However, me and the critics don't always see eye to eye, and so I went into Ignition full of hope, full of wide-eyed wonder, and I'm glad to say the game sucks ass.
I'm sorry.
During the course of this review, I'll detail what it does right, and the many things it does wrong. Now let's dive in. What makes a Dead Space game a Dead Space game? Is it limb dismemberment, third-person action-based horror? Or is it the world itself, where the environments and lore you uncover are as rich in character as the protagonists themselves? Whatever you think makes a Dead Space game a Dead Space game, I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't a puzzle game, and that's exactly what Ignition is. Changing genre isn't necessarily a bad thing when it's done well. With enough hallmarks of the series to tie it all in, it doesn't matter if it's a departure from what came before. Just look at Extraction. But the issue is Ignition doesn't do anything that well. Now I'm going to use my powers here to read your mind. When you started playing Dead Space 2, I know you were thinking, who's this guy opening my cell? What's his story? What's driven him to free Isaac? I bet he's going to be really important going forwards in the, oh wait, he's dead. Well, that guy is Franco Delisle, and he's the main protagonist of Ignition. The story sees Delisle and his secret lover Sarah Anderson working on the Sprawl, a space station located on Saturn's moon Titan. As an engineer, it's his job to make sure things are staying in tip-top shape, and as it would happen, today isn't going to be a typical 9 to 5, as the Sprawl has been visited by some unwelcome guests. The story is literally a pick-your-own-adventure comic. You start and end in the same place regardless of choice, but how you get there depends on you. Will you go and fix the lighting, or assist in a hostage rescue? Whichever choice you pick branches off into separate choices, making a maximum of 4 different playthroughs to see how the story can change. And at only 90 minutes for a first run, and getting considerably shorter with each subsequent playthrough, there isn't a huge time investment to see how differently these scenarios can play out. Now, without spoiling it, some of these paths weave a satisfying story, where in others, there's decisions that play out that seem to come out of nowhere, with no emotional weight and no rational explanation. It's like a switch is pressed and Delisle goes from normal person to straight up psychopath. Now, is it the marker making him do this? His devotion to unitology? Or something else? I don't know. And the story doesn't bother to hang around and answer that. Now, with the entire plot being delivered through a motion comic, you'd expect the art and voice acting to be top notch. But just like Delisle's motivation, it can't remain consistent. The pendulum swings from great to Dragon Ball Super level, from performances that complement the art, to whatever the hell this is.
We're a little busy right now, Weaver.
I don't care if you're on fire. Get over.
Did you cut him off?
Yeah, fuck him.
Run that back.
We're a little busy right now, Weaver.
I don't care if you're on fire. Get over.
I can only assume the voice talent didn't see the stills, because if they did, there's no way they'd deliver the lines in the cadence and tone that they are. The entire story, from the choices to the performances, feels disjointed, sloppy, and half-hearted. But with any game, it all boils down to gameplay. And as I said at the outset, Ignition is a puzzle game. The comic will bring you to a scenario where you will need to do a multitude of tasks to open doors, fix lights, or hack into machines. And these tasks are broken down into 3 different categories. Hardware cracks, which are logic-based puzzles. In these, you need to line up lasers into their separate endpoints, and by combining red and green, you can make yellow. Solve the puzzle before the time's up, and you're golden. Secondly, you have trace puzzles, where you need to hack into a system. The goal is to reach the end before the AI, while avoiding objects and other AI traces that'll slow you down. It's the closest you can get to a sperm simulator. So if nothing else, you could probably use this to teach reproduction in a high school class. Finally, you have system overrides. It's essentially a tower defense game. You have a multitude of units at your disposal, and it's your job to get past all the defenses and damage the end goal. Now as the game progresses, each branching path you take along the 4 chapters will upgrade your rig, leading to a larger pool of options at your disposal. For tracers, you'll now have access to the same countermeasures as the AI, which you can use against them to aid your progress to the goal. For the hardware cracks, you'll gain additional nodes to make larger and more complex paths for the lasers, as well as the option to remove obstacles entirely. And finally, when it comes to the system overrides, you get to use advanced viruses, which can turn the opposing AI against itself, or cloak a unit, which can get past basic defenses without an issue. These upgrades are used to keep the experience fresh along the 4 chapters. The puzzles ramp in difficulty, and on the first playthrough, it's clear they are designed to show you how to use these new upgrades effectively. And to the game's credit, it was rare that I beat any of them on the first attempt. The logic puzzles in particular proved quite challenging, and there was a satisfying feeling in finally figuring out the solution to these. So if nothing else, Ignition proved one thing to me: I wouldn't make a great Vulcan. Now with 4 playthroughs needed to see every branching path, that equates to a total of 33 different puzzles, which to see all of it will take about 5 or so hours. Now after finishing the first run, I was invested enough to see through all the different story paths and their puzzles through to completion. But, as with most things in this game, there's an issue with this too. Unfortunately, the devs made the decision to keep your rig fully upgraded after your first run. And all this meant was the subsequent playthroughs were incredibly simple, as the tools you have from the endgame make a mockery of the first 3 chapters. For those of you that feel particularly competitive, Ignition offers a leaderboard where you can aim for the fastest overall completion time. Now I can't say I'm one of those people, but it's nice to have the option thrown in for good measure. And to be honest, the main reason you're playing this is because upon completion of the game, it unlocks some goodies for use in Dead Space 2. Now you get access to a hacker suit, which makes hacks easier in the main game, a new skin for the contact beam, and access to conduit rooms which contain a host of goodies as well as audio logs from Delisle himself. Now as I'd never played Ignition before, it could be that my issues with the story told here are solved in Dead Space 2, but personally, I hate the idea that this content was locked behind completion of another separate experience, and especially one that is chargeable at $3.99. Ignition was bundled in as a freebie to people who pre-ordered Dead Space 2, but why should those people get a gameplay advantage over others? Locking content out to inflate pre-order numbers is scummy as hell, and is something that games do all the time even today. It's a practice I don't usually take part in. 99% of the time, I'll choose to not redeem the codes that give additional advantages, as I don't want the experience hampered by an artificial reduction in difficulty or resource management. Granted, this is a very personal gripe, and one that I'll have to put to the side when I boot Dead Space 2, as I want to see just how much of an impact these conduit rooms make to the experience. Will they fill in some of the blanks in Ignition's story and make me look over this experience with a greater appreciation? Or will it confirm my fear that this kind of cross-progression to inflate pre-orders is potentially harmful to the experience? We'll have to wait and see on that. Now to bring this review to a close, Ignition is a throwaway game which leaves everything that makes Dead Space what it is at the door. It gives us the backstory to a character I couldn't care less about, while delivering its story through inconsistent art and voice acting. The puzzles can be enjoyable, but after 90 minutes, the game has lost all its luster. Now I love a short, sweet experience as much as the next guy, but Ignition isn't that. By the time I'd done all 4 story paths, I had nothing but a sour taste in my mouth. Do yourself a favour and avoid playing through Ignition. It's not worth the $3.99, and more importantly, it's not worth your time. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it and subscribe for more Dead Space content. I try to respond to everyone on my channel, so let me know what your thoughts on the game are and we can discuss it. Up next, I'll be moving over to Resident Evil for the Shadow of Rose DLC, as well as RE Verse, before looping back to the rest of the Dead Space series. Now I look forward to seeing you back here soon. If you're still craving that little bit more from me, consider checking out my podcast, In PS We Trust. It's a PlayStation podcast where me and my co-hosts discuss the latest news, rumours and hype for all things survival horror and PlayStation. I'll have links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. We have arrived at Dead Space Mobile. When I set out to review all the Dead Space games, I didn't even know this existed, and when an audience member informed me of it, I didn't think to cover it. But as the reviews kept coming, I saw similar comments time after time, each suggesting the game was outstanding, and so curiosity got the better of me, and I went for it. Now, mobile gaming to me is a dirty word, like microtransactions or loot boxes. It's something I'm acutely aware exists, but nothing that I partake in. My last foray into this ecosystem was back in the wild heights of Flappy Bird back in 2013, and before that, it was Cut the Rope and Temple Run. To say I've got a blind spot in my gaming habits is to put it mildly, and the reason for that is, to me, mobile games are just slimmed down versions of games that are better everywhere else. The mobile market relies on a race to the bottom pricing structure, resulting in games having to take the free-to-play model, littered with egregious monetization to stay afloat. And this causes players to be nickel and dimed to just continue to take part in the game, with the so-called whales accreamed for the benefit of ever-increasing profit. But even in this chaotic minefield, where every game that is truly fantastic is surrounded by thousands of ship-riddled moneymakers, if you can identify that great game and put some shine on it, that's worth sharing. And so, I can see why the audience was screaming at me to cover this, because to put it bluntly, the game kicks ass. In this review, I'm going to detail why that is, what the team at Iron Monkey did to bring Dead Space to the mobile medium, and how it ties into the events of Dead Space 2. Now usually, I'd split this review into plot, gameplay and presentation, but for this one, I'm going to break the mold. Mobile gaming is uncharted territory for me after all. There will be story spoilers within, but I'll provide a timestamp to get around that. Now let's dive in. Dead Space Mobile was developed by Iron Monkey Studios and published by EA, releasing on the 25th of January 2011 for iOS, namely the iPhone, iPad and iPod Touch. It was supposedly exclusive to these devices, but by August 18, 2011, it was released for all Android devices, the Kindle Fire and BlackBerry Playbook tablet, meaning as long as you had a smart device, Dead Space could give it ya. And give it ya, it certainly did, as the critical reception was overwhelmingly positive, netting a Metacritic score of 88, and it went on to win the Best Mobile Game in 2011 at the Mephi Awards and iPad Game of the Year at the App Store Rewind. Now I'm sad to say, there's no legal way to get a hold of this anymore, as the game was pulled from all stores by 2016, mostly down to a lack of compatibility with newer devices. So, to play this, I found an APK online and installed it onto my Samsung S20 Plus. Now I'll put a link to the site I found it on in the comments for anyone that wants to check it out following this review, but I better move this away from the history and onto the present day experience. Dead Space Mobile finds us in control of Vandal, aka Carrie Norton. Vandal is sent on a sabotage mission within the government sector of the Sprawl under the orders of the Church of Unitology. As a new inductee to the church, Vandal doesn't suspect there's anything wrong, and why should she? This is the church after all. Nothing bad ever happened with religion.
Now, I'm getting the word nonce.
So after following orders and destroying some power boxes, which wipes out the comms, she realizes she's unintentionally released an outbreak of biblical proportions. And her reward?
Listen to me. What you see before you is your reward for today's accomplishment. You're to be one of the first blessed with ascension. The authorities are locking down the sprawl, cutting off the lines, locking you in, but don't be afraid. Your death will be glorious. A holy path of life beyond the death the church promised you.
The realization that she'll be the cause of countless deaths if they ever reach the sprawl pushes Vandal onwards to repair the damage that's been caused, to right the wrongs, and make the church pay for their trickery. Guiding her across her mission to avert disaster is Tyler Radikoff, a fellow unitologist that sticks to the comms, guiding Vandal throughout the game. Now, I'll move this into spoilers, so skip ahead if you want to avoid them. Now, if you've played Dead Space 2, you know that this mission to stop a necromorph outbreak didn't quite go to plan. And the reason for this is Vandal is gullible as fuck. The old adage, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, has never been so prevalent. It's like that guard in a Key and Peele sketch.
You gotta let me out of here.
Oh, okay.
I'm not saying I have a giant IQ here, but even a toddler would have second thoughts.
Listen carefully. The first thing you have to do is open the door to the public sector.
Or you're nuts. That door's the only thing keeping the monsters on this side of the sprawl.
Not if the seal's broken, it's not. Listen to me. Opening that door during a quarantine lockdown will set off the emergency fail-safes and lock down all the doors. Not just the tube, but the hub as well. It's the quickest way. Just take out the door security.
Oh my God.
You truly lived up to your name.
The power's down. All the doors are jammed open.
You tricked me.
So ultimately, Vandal, in her quest to put things right, inadvertently makes things 100 times worse, setting the scene for Isaac to do some serious cleaning up in Dead Space 2. What I appreciate with Dead Space Mobile is how it didn't take the easy way out. It didn't retell DS1, or even chuck in a throwaway plot that added nothing to the wider series. It's a prelude to the events of Dead Space 2, and is essential to knowing what caused the outbreak to happen on the sprawl. It further cements the church as the big bad across this franchise, and shows how devious they can act to get what they want. Now, usually with a Dead Space game, you'd expect there to be a host of audio logs or written text documents that help fill in the background, but here, that isn't the case. And to be honest, I don't miss them. It could be due to Vandal leaving herself audio logs which can then be found in Dead Space 2, or that most chapters begin with a conversation with Tyler or the head of the sprawl, Hans Tideman. With each chapter being 30 or so minutes to complete, they move at such a pace that the lack of additional information didn't create the feeling that anything had been lost. You know the main bulk of the story lifting is going to take place in Dead Space 2, so anything further here would have been redundant. What we experience here in the run-up to DS2 does everything it needs to do, and that's more than enough for a mobile tie-in. So with the plot getting a resounding tick, the big question is gameplay. Does the move from traditional controller to touchscreen affect the experience? Did they manage to capture the same mechanics that make a Dead Space game a Dead Space game? Well, let's take a look. Dead Space relies on item conservation and underpins it with an in-game economy. This returns, with the only difference being Vandal has auto-recovering health. You still need to find ammo which is hidden in the environment and drop from enemies upon death, giving you incentive to take on the threats that approach from all sides. Credits are used to purchase ammo, suit upgrades, guns and nodes, and so by managing your resources, you can sell your additional stock to make you more efficient at wiping out those troublesome necromorphs. The classic arsenal of the first entry returns, alongside their ability to switch to alternate firing modes to adapt to the threats in your way. Stasis, kinesis, and even zero-G traversal are all here, and it's in the use of its touchscreen controls that make all of these staples still feel as effective as they always have been. To switch to alternate fire, you tilt the screen. To use stasis, you touch the stasis gauge on Vandal's shoulder. Kinesis, you touch the icon on the screen. To pull up the gun, you touch the right side of your screen and then fire by pressing again. The diegetic design which Dead Space has always relied on is taken to the next level in this entry, as that design is fully interactable as a control scheme. It works intuitively and took no time at all to acclimatize. I didn't feel like I was missing a traditional controller, and that's huge praise, as this is the area that could have made the entire experience fall flat. Now, in saying this, playing it today on a downloaded APK, you are going to experience issues. They aren't the game's fault, but rather the issue of playing it on a device that was never intended to run it. They aren't huge, but they are worth mentioning. Here we go. Enemies will bug out, causing huge tears as their arms and legs stretch into spikes which pierce into the environment, obscuring your vision and creating some weird ass visuals. Using kinesis becomes a gamble whether or not it decides to work, or if you're going to pull up your gun. Opening crates is a test of patience, as 9 out of 10 times you'll ready a weapon. And finally, if a lurker or a swarmer get on you, it's pretty much a game over, as the touchscreen mashing doesn't seem to respond very well, unintentionally making them the scariest enemies in the entire game. Now, as long as you can accept issues will happen and find your own way to adapt to it, either by hitting a specific part of the screen or changing your camera angle to enable interaction, you can overcome them. Now, in doing research online, I'm not seeing any issues from people who played it contemporary to its release, and I'm sure if I played this on an iPhone 4, it would be fine. So I'm not going to hold it against the game in 2023, but I did want to make you all aware before you choose to dive in for yourself. Now, when it comes to its presentation, the game actually doesn't have anything in common with its tie-in title Dead Space 2. It's actually more reminiscent of your time aboard the Ishimura. The chapters begin and end with boarding a tram. The upgrade bench, store and breakable crates are taken directly from Dead Space 1, and even the design on Vandal's armor is more in keeping with an engineer rather than the Space Marine armor Isaac dons in DS2. The environments themselves are cramped corridors with the color palette design and lighting imitating that of the Ishimura rather than the open areas of the sprawl found in Dead Space 2. The reason for this is bound to be the limited power available on mobile devices at this time, and it's also the reason why enemies come in waves rather than big crowds. You'll often encounter 4 necromorphs at a maximum, with the wave repeating 5 or so times rather than face them all in one go. It helps with performance, and ultimately, it's the best solution they could do given the platform the game is designed for. Now, with this experience essentially boiling down to fighting waves of necromorphs in one corridor to the next, moving from lockdown to lockdown with little exploration and no collectibles, it could be boring as piss, but due to the chapters being short, it benefits from being a pick up and play game, where you don't want or need to spend long periods of time in each session. I played and captured all this gameplay on my train ride to and from work. I banged on some headphones, pulled the phone up, and started my day the best way I could, by shooting off the limbs of necromorphs. And that's exactly what it was designed for, to give you that Dead Space experience on the go. And nowhere is this more true than the atmosphere. The corridors may be all you see, but that doesn't mean they lack character or scares. Far from it. Due to the marker's influence, Vandal experiences hallucinations across the game. They start off small, but soon turn into entire sequences where you don't know if you're fighting enemies or wrestling with your own sanity. The sound design, visuals and scene setting coalesce to form an experience where you never really know if what you're seeing is reality or if you're about to walk into an ambush. You can feel Vandal losing her mind to a much greater extent than Isaac did in DS1. Iron Monkey Studios had a lot of fun with this across the game, creating some incredibly memorable sequences which always brought a smile to my face. One moment the room is empty, the next is littered with bodies. 1 minute you're seeing a reflection of yourself, before this morphs into a QTE against a necromorph. It keeps you on the edge of your seat, and stops the experience becoming stale. In looking back, I must have looked like a goddamn psycho. I'm on a train with a Joker-esque grin staring at my phone, mashing on the screen like a toddler who just discovered YouTube Kids. but I couldn't care less. Every time I booted the game, I was drawn into this world, into its simple yet effective plot, and it all comes down to nailing what it set out to do, to bring Dead Space to the mobile phone and retain the brand's identity. That's what Iron Monkey did here, and that's why this game succeeds. It knows what it is, leans into it, and still manages to surprise the player with memorable sequences and tight controls. If you haven't played Dead Space Mobile, and you're a fan of the series, I'd encourage you to download it. You won't regret it. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it, and consider subscribing to the channel for more Dead Space content. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts on the game in the comments section. I try to respond to everyone, so I'll look forward to hearing from you. Up next is my favourite entry of the entire series, and a game I haven't played since its release, Dead Space 2. I look forward to seeing you back here soon. Now if you still want more from me, and you're a fan of PlayStation, consider checking out my podcast In PS We Trust. It's a PlayStation podcast where me and my co-hosts crack a few beers and discuss the latest news, rumours and hype for all things survival horror and PlayStation. I'll have links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. It's been a long road, but we have finally arrived at Dead Space 2. Developed by Visceral Games and published by EA, Dead Space 2 released on the 25th of January 2011 for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 and PC, and it released to overwhelming critical praise, netting a Metacritic score of 90%, which puts it as the highest rated survival horror from the 7th generation of consoles. And for me, it's always been regarded as my favourite entry in the entire series. So going into this experience, I was brimming with anticipation, with childlike excitement. I played the game on its release, and after several playthroughs at that time, I haven't been back. Now memory is a strange beast. The passing of time can distort events, leading to assumptions which may not necessarily be true. My memory paints DS2 as a game which raises the action from the first game, and this has caused some trepidation on whether this increase in pace would erode any tension and atmosphere which the first entry had created so flawlessly. Well, I had no reason to worry. Over the course of this review, I'm going to detail how Dead Space 2 blows all of my expectations out of the water, how it raises the bar that came before, and cements itself as one of the best video game sequels of all time. As always, I'm going to split this into plot, gameplay and presentation, and it's worth mentioning, I will cover spoilers for the original Dead Space, so if you haven't played it and you don't want to know what happened, it's worth coming back to this review after playing it. For the Dead Space 2 spoilers, I'll include timestamps to help you navigate around them. Now let's dive in. The year is 2511. 3 years have passed since the events on board the USS Ishimura, and we find Isaac Clarke detained in a hospital ward. He is awoken by Franco Delisle. You may remember him as the protagonist of Dead Space Ignition.
I don't want to remember nothing. Nothing. You understand?
It's here that Isaac learns he's on the Sprawl, a massive space station built on the remains of Saturn's moon Titan. But where have those 3 years gone? And why can't he remember anything? Before he has time to ponder these questions, all hell breaks loose around him. Franco is turned into a necromorph and the entire ward descends into chaos. A morning jog later, escaping the kind of horrors that would make me chuck myself out of the airlock, Isaac is freed from his straitjacket and realises the run-in with the marker has left more than a lasting impression on him, and it's one that many of us have experienced in our lives. Everywhere he goes, he has a run-in with his ex. Now, that's a living hell for any of us. For Isaac, it's even worse. Nicole died aboard the Ishimura, and what he's seeing is the manifestation of the marker's influence, a living embodiment of his guilt. And when Dinah Le Guin promises to help him get rid of these visions, he jumps at the opportunity. Joining him on this adventure are two accomplices, Ellie Langford, a CEC pilot caught up in the madness overtaking the sprawl, and Nolan Stross, a senior science officer who underwent exposure to the marker on board the USG O'Bannon, causing him to suffer with the same psychotic delusions as Isaac. With the pair's help, Isaac sets out to destroy the marker on board the sprawl and end the outbreak for good. Dead Space 2 follows in the path laid out in the original Dead Space, relying on a host of audio logs and written documents that help expand on the world, filling in the stories of recently deceased characters that now litter the sprawl. They are just as effective as the first game, feeling like essential pieces of lore, rewarding you for your exploration. And when matched to the environmental storytelling of the sprawl itself, the marriage is one made in heaven. Isaac, this time around, is an active participant of the sprawl's descent into anarchy, and as such, you see the horror unfold all around you, from witnessing patients mid-operation begging for you to release them before death approaches, to empty apartments where the unitologist faithful have taken their own lives in readiness for the ascension. It's horrific, and the more you learn about these areas and the people that until recently lived there, it elicits a feeling of sorrow, where you are left pondering how unwavering commitment to what is essentially a suicide cult could be mass adopted. I suppose people want something to believe in, and when coupled to a conspiracy story of government cover-ups, the appeal becomes that much more palpable. Now, speaking of unitology, it may have been introduced and peppered throughout Dead Space 1, but here, in Dead Space 2, the lore is expanded greatly. Hell, we even get a chance to go on a tour of a unitologist church, which starts off fairly normal at first, but the deeper you go, the more nefarious it becomes, just like the religion itself. It shows how members are psychoanalyzed to determine their likelihood of indoctrination, and how the elite are frozen underneath the church in readiness for ascension. Exploring this location was a real highlight for me. It fuses a church and a museum, and juxtaposes this with an almost theme park level of money grabbing, which felt both absurd and yet fully rooted within this world. And that's what great environmental storytelling does. It gives you glimpses into things that, on their own, would feel abstract or jarring, and meshes them together to flavor the environment to make it feel lived in, and in this case, horrific. To see moments in people's lives and how they have come to an untimely end either through their own choice or the choice of others. Moving away from the environmental storytelling and barreling directly into the narrative itself, Dead Space 2 makes one change from the original, and is one that was extremely welcome. Owlboy Isaac has found his voice. No longer is he a vessel for the player to project themselves onto. Now, he's a fully realized character, one racked by guilt over Nicole's fate and battling the PTSD inflicted on him by the marker. Throughout the experience, it's Isaac's personal journey of confronting this trauma and overcoming it in the face of ever-increasing turmoil. Having Isaac take control of the plot, to become an active instead of passive protagonist, was the smartest choice Visceral could have made. To see Isaac's reactions when the helmet comes down, to hear his pitch, cadence and regret singed into every syllable during his conversations with Nicole, as he fights off the marker's influence and comes to terms with what he's done. It invests you into this story, and you root for him to overcome the odds. The first game was the Ishimura story. This is very much Isaac's, and everything told through the environment and pickups is icing on the already masterful cake. It's an improvement on every level. Now I'm going to move this into spoilers to detail one last piece of the pie that makes the Dead Space series so unique. So if you are keeping this spoiler free, skip ahead to the timestamp shown. Dead Space 1 and 2 omit a traditional antagonist. In DS1, at a stretch you could say it's any number of people, Dr. Mercer, Kendra Daniels, but really they are pieces of the plot, but not the driving force. DS2, you could say the antagonist is Dinah, but she is gone by a quarter or so in, so that leaves Hans Tiedemann, the man responsible for managing the sprawl. Now I always remembered this guy as an absolute dickhead. A guy who pops up throughout the story to either try to kill Isaac or to shut down his momentum. A guy who eventually gets his comeuppance at the hands of our main man Isaac. Now after playing it through for the review, it turns out I was totally wrong about him. Hans Tiedemann is actually a hero.
You're shitting me. I'm not shitting on you.
Sure, he was aware and participated in the creation of a new marker, trapping Isaac and the many other participants in their own hell for years, and yes, if it wasn't for those experiments, the outbreak wouldn't have had a chance of happening. But his intentions were good. Unlimited power to put an end to planet cracking. Okay, I'm not making this seem even, am I? Alright, well, how's this? Isaac saves one person, Ellie Langford, and that's in the entire game. And even then, she half saves herself. Tiedemann is responsible for the population of the Sprawl, which is around 1 million people. He goes against his orders and issues an evacuation. Now, if we even lowball it and say 1% escape, that's 10,000 people. Isaac did 1. And Hans is polite. He's always apologising when he goes to kill you, and that goes a long way. Alright, I'm clutching at straws here. But Tiedemann isn't the bad guy I thought he was. He has shades of grey. He's ignorant, yes. Evil, no. The true nemesis in the Dead Space series is the marker itself, and the millions under its illusion brought about by the Church of Unitology. And in both of these games, you have people acting for those goals, but never a central figurehead. Now if you compare that to say another survival horror franchise, and we go for the biggest one, Resident Evil. The big bad for the majority of the series is Umbrella, but your main villain is Albert Wesker. He's the guy pulling the strings for most of the entries. He's the person you love to hate, the face you identify with as the cause of your suffering. Dead Space, up to the point of Dead Space 2, has had 4 different entries, and we still don't know who runs the church, who is responsible or financing this entire operation. We don't know. And it's that mystery that makes the game so appealing. We are dealing with Isaac versus an entire belief system, and one that is predicated on an unknown alien race which needs dead matter to create a convergence event, where everyone can be whole to do the marker's bidding. It's so much more than a mere man, and that's what makes it feel so daunting. It's not like taking down one person or one company will make everything right again. Here, in this universe, it's on a much larger scale, and holding any one person to account feels like a fallacy. After all, with the sheer power the church holds over the public, would anyone believe or even care about what happened on the Sprawl? That's what makes the series so impactful to me. Tiedemann may be an adversary, but he's not serving the wider big bad. He's doing his own thing for his own reasons. And this nuance seeds the ground as the starting point for the wider conflict between EarthGov and the church. Isaac is a man stuck in the middle of all of this, playing cleanup while one side seeks to catch and the other kill him. It's levels of depth which stick with you long after the game ends, as you try to piece all the individual parts together, and one where you can't wait to learn more about the world itself, to see where it's going to go next. The levels of depth added with this entry add more questions the deeper you go into it, and it's in this mystery that creates so much intrigue. And that's why I'm glad it forgoes installing someone as a figurehead, as a true antagonist, as moving against a belief is far more engaging than a physical threat. If you haven't guessed it by now, the plot of Dead Space 2 succeeds on every level. It builds on what came before, showing us extra peeks behind the curtain, but never giving enough away to ruin the mystery that underpins the franchise. It focuses instead on Isaac, on his mental battle following the events of the Ishimura, turning him from a husk we project ourselves onto to a fully realized character, and backs this up with an ensemble cast which complement the experience. It's a game of scale, where the stakes are raised, but it never becomes verbose. What makes a sequel great? It's a question which many game developers don't seem to know the answer to. For every Uncharted 2, you have an Overwatch 2. But in my personal belief, what makes a sequel great is understanding what worked so well before, staying true to that, but focusing it through a new lens. In the case of Dead Space 2, it shares many if not all of the core gameplay loops I spoke about in my Dead Space 1 video, but elevates the experience with a bigger, more bombastic approach. Think of it like Alien to Aliens. You take the same enemy, one we are acutely aware of, and you make more of them. To offset that, you arm the heroes with more firepower than they know what to do with, and then surprise them with fresh new forms and higher personal stakes. Aliens is my favourite movie of all time, and I have to believe that Jim Cameron's masterpiece must have played some inspiration into how to up the action without diluting the experience. In researching online, Visceral's goal this time out was to make DS2 more appealing to a wider audience, and they would do this by introducing action elements and making Isaac easier to control. But what's here is far more than that. If you look at the base combat, on the face of it, it's identical. You fight necromorphs and kill them by shooting off their limbs. Your resources are limited, but by exploring the environment, it gives you the opportunity to find ammo, credits and nodes. Credits can be used in the store to buy or sell items and weapons, and the nodes are used to upgrade your arsenal or unlock doors which contain blueprints for new items and a host of goodies. It forces you to partake in an in-game economy where you're unsure what you should sell, what you should buy, and if you should pump those extra credits into more nodes so you can become a deadly force against the seemingly unending waves of necromorphs. It seems familiar, right? Well, this is the base experience in Dead Space 1, and that triumphantly returns. So how have they built on this to ensure the experience doesn't feel like one we've taken before? Well, the first major change comes with kinesis. In the original, one of my only complaints was how useless kinesis felt. It was mainly relegated to puzzle sections which are solved at first sight. Using it in combat was like signing your death warrant. Here, in Dead Space 2, it becomes invaluable. The damage inflicted by a pole or a slasher blade is catastrophic, and there's nothing more flashy than mowing down one enemy, ripping off their blade and hurling it at the next target. It never gets old. And it's not just the damage either, it's fast. Objects don't slowly work their way to you. Now, they snap into you so quickly that I even had fun throwing harmless objects just to torment the hapless bastard that dared to cause me a jump scare. The next change comes in the form of zero-G areas. In DS1, you'd aim at a section of the environment and jump off, floating to your destination. It worked great, and I didn't know I needed anything different in my life, until I turned into Iron Man. I completely forgot this existed, so when I took off, I had a shit-eating grin on my face the entire time. It meant that no longer do you have to reorient yourself on where your threats are located after taking off. Now you can fly into the abyss and rain hell down on your enemies. and it enables levels of verticality and scale to the handful of times you need to do puzzles. It's simply outstanding. Now, speaking of scale, this added mobility option gives Visceral a chance to go all Uncharted 2 on us, by providing breakneck sequences where Isaac boosts through the air, dodging debris or blasting back down to meet up with his comrades. These sections are intense, visually stunning, and are peppered in at just the right moment that they feel like a fitting crescendo. Now, with all these changes, you have the potential to make Isaac overpowered, or at worst, destroy the atmosphere, turning it into nothing more than an action game. But that's not the case, and it's mainly down to the enemies themselves. The first game introduced us to a host of necromorph types, each serving its own purpose, which, when combined into groups, are extremely formidable opponents. Its sequel raises this with a further 8 types. Now, I won't talk through all of these, but the ones that truly stand out are the Pack and the Stalker, both having very different roles to play and both eliciting wide-eyed terror. The Pack are children, and there are fucking loads of them. They go down easily, but they are quick and seem to come from everywhere. You have no choice but to run, reposition, unload, and watch your arse. The first encounter with them is harrowing, but this is soon escalated as you move through a school and realise you haven't seen numbers like this before. You need to know your arsenal strengths, their weaknesses, and which tools are suited to the task at hand, as one slip up and it's GG's. The game has multiple encounters with them. Sometimes you're given room to wiggle, to move, and others you're in a small enclosed space darting the camera in front and behind you as you struggle to contain control of the situation and create space. Juxtaposed to this are the Stalkers. They sneak around the environment to get the drop on you, peering out around and above cover before finally making a mad dash at you, causing severe damage if they ever get close. After their first appearance in the church, you soon come to realise when you're going to do battle with them. The environment is designed to accommodate them, and it never fails to put you on a knife edge. You feel the pace drop to a crawl as your heart rate begins to rise. You fire blindly, hoping to get a lucky hit, all the while hearing them squawk and shuffle all around. And when they finally burst out with a blood-curdling screech, you need to be hot on the stasis and ensure you got something big enough to take them out quick. I adored their inclusion so much. I never found them a cakewalk, even right near the end of the game. They demand your attention, your respect, and there's not a feeling quite like hitting one with stasis when they're stuck to cover and beating the living shit out of them. The beauty in the combat of Dead Space isn't so much about a single enemy type, it's how they all work together to challenge the player. Across the approximately 8 to 9 hour runtime of the game, the sheer variety of enemies and groupings of them ensures you can never relax. They can burst through or jump from the scenery at any time, and as they pose a real threat, it creates tension that never fades. Oh my god, there's creatures everywhere! Oh! Oh! Oh shit! Oh shit! Ah! Ah! Get me in the lift! Oh fuck, are you serious?
Oh shit! I didn't think it was anything down here.
As you can tell, I found myself on edge for the entire experience, and that is remarkable. For most survival horror games, the more you encounter enemies and the later the experience goes, the less fear there is, as the power seems to swing from the enemies to you as you use your knowledge and an expanded arsenal to dish out retribution. In Dead Space 2, it's not like that. You may be more powerful, have more resources, more tools, but the challenge scales perfectly alongside it. Incredible game design doesn't happen on accident. It's a balancing act, and that's what Dead Space 2 does so well. The amount of ammo the enemies drop is just right. The damage they do is fair. And when you make a mistake, you know it's on you. How you played the encounter, the choices you made both in and before the battle. You need to get better, to learn and try something different. And it gets you doubting yourself. Did I prepare enough at the store? Or did I get overzealous with upgrades and not give myself enough ammo to get the job done? Thanos put it perfectly.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
And when it comes to taking this challenge on, DS2 brings back the classic arsenal from the first game and introduces a few new ones. Now, I've always been a sucker for the plasma cutter, assault rifle and Ripper trio. Joining them for the coveted 4th slot was a tough choice, as now you have access to a javelin gun, detonator, rivet gun, and a seeker rifle. My favourite out of these is easily the javelin gun. This gun kicks ass. Necromorphs hit by this thing ragdoll through the air and become nothing more than wall decorations. And with its secondary fire, the bolt embedded in an enemy spits out lightning which can take out multiple threats at once, adding to its versatility in combat. Now, I'm not saying the other guns don't have purpose or aren't effective, it's just personal preference. And with the added choice available here, you have the ability to shake up multiple playthroughs or even just dabble between them to find the one that really suits your style. And that's never a bad thing. Now, speaking of style, let's talk about the suits. In the original Dead Space, you'd find schematics and use them to upgrade the base suit. Now, this would change Isaac's appearance, adding more visible armor to the design, increasing damage resistance, and the number of slots available for your items. Dead Space 2 does things pretty much the same. However, the differences in design and the benefit the armor provides vary drastically. Some are just a steady increase in slots and armor, just like DS1, but others provide additional damage for selected weapons, stored discounts, or make the hacking minigames easier. And I have to tip the hat here. The design on these suits are nothing short of beautiful. The suits themselves are found across the environment, completing different difficulties or completing Dead Space Ignition, if you really want to do that. I generally cared more about how they looked compared to their benefit, but I bet on the higher difficulties, you want to use any advantage you can to make your experience that little bit easier. To me, the way they are included here is a natural evolution on the first game, and it's another element of choice and player variety that I am grateful was included here. Now, unfortunately, not everything can be a hit, and I have two areas which I wish were expanded on a little more. They are very minor issues, but I feel it's worth raising them here. The first is the breakable windows. At various points of the game, you encounter amazing vistas peering out onto Saturn. Now, if you notice a small triangle above the window, it means you can shoot the glass and suck all the enemies out into the vacuum of space. Seeing a host of necromorphs fly out the window as you slowly approach the abyss is extremely cinematic. You need to react fast to shoot the seal to save yourself suffering the same fate. But the issue I have here is it feels there's hardly any opportunity to use this mechanic. Now, I'm not saying I want it all the time, but at only 4 times across the game, it doesn't rise to become anything more than a cool gimmick. And I wish their inclusion could have been more realised, to make you scared to blind fire at the risk of getting decompressed any time you're around windows. But who knows, maybe too much of a good thing would have ruined the pacing if you're constantly getting sucked off.
Come again?
The final issue I have is with the hacking. Now, throughout the game, you have to engage with this minigame whereby you move your analog stick until it vibrates and lights up blue, hit the button, and well done, I guess. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just there. Now in Dead Space Extraction, they handled hacking brilliantly, as you're having to do it while fighting off hordes of enemies. This makes it extremely tense, and even though it's a piece of piss on its own, the added pressure elevates it, whereby you find yourself making stupid mistakes time and time again until you finally compose yourself and crack it. The only time it's done well in DS2 is due to the pressure of an approaching threat late into the game, and so unfortunately, outside of that one glimmer of greatness, taking part in the activity is generally tedious. Now, to come away from a game with only 2 minor critiques is testament to how great Dead Space 2 is to play. It's a game that builds on what came before and elevates it with greater threats, bigger moments, and more choice for the player in how they approach combat. It may have upped the action, but due to its constant tension, it never loses its fear factor. Now, when it comes to evoking fear, it all comes down to the atmosphere, and so it's time to move it onto presentation. Fear, dread, foreboding. 3 different feelings that many games try to elicit, but very few actually manage to achieve. And to keep that feeling consistent across an entire game is extremely rare. Dead Space 2 manages this effortlessly. Now, we all experience emotions in our own way, so I can only truly explain my own reflections on how this is achieved so effectively. It all starts with the music and lighting. Jason Greaves returns as composer, bringing the same organically scaling flair as the original. The quiet moments create a sense of mystery and underlying dread, where the environment around you breaks through the silence with distant screams, nursery rhymes, or at its freakiest, the sound of rustling through the many grates all around. It gives you a chance to slow down and soak up the audio logs, to breathe in the environmental storytelling, and when it kicks off, it kicks off. The music swells, sharp strings stab, and deep bass booms as you fight tooth and nail. Listening to the score away from the game, there isn't the same catchy themes that early survival horror utilized to characterize its areas. It takes a different role here, staying just beneath the surface, choosing to play an additive to the atmosphere, rather than a key character of it. It never distracts, and it never disappoints. The lighting too is extremely similar in Dead Space 2 as the original. Light spark, flicker, burst, and work in tandem with the scenery to bring smoke, shadows, and various other environmental effects to life. The big difference this time is the environment itself. The Sprawl, being a space station compared to a single ship, gave Visceral a golden ticket to make the environments as visually distinct as they want. From shopping malls to the mines of Titan, everywhere you go feels unique, and at the same time connected to the world. And it's in this variety that you never get a sense of comfort, as you never know what's around that next corner. Now, there's one exception to that rule, and it's one I need to move into spoilers for, so please feel free to skip ahead. The Ishimura. It had been 3 short years between Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2, and in that time, the planet Cracker had burrowed into our minds, making it one of those rare gaming locations that becomes a character in its own right. I remember when I first played the game, I'd only finished Dead Space 1 a few short months before Dead Space 2's launch, and even with that short time frame, the ship had left such a lasting impression that the mere thought of entering it again put the fear of God into me. The apprehension I felt as I walked through key locations was palpable. I could cut the tension with a knife. And then, nothing. You slowly relax, before that lapse of judgment comes crashing down around you and you fight to contain your bowels. What a genius idea. To not just give the player a throwback, but to also show just how important reclaiming the ship and the marker are to the UGC and the church. It's a perfect set piece, on the same level as returning to Shadow Moses in MGS4 or Burial at Sea in Bioshock. It's one of those moments that you hardly ever see in video games, and when it's done as effectively as this, I can't help but look back on the memories and smile. When it came to playing DS2, I chose to play it on my PlayStation 3. The reason for this is, well, I don't own an Xbox, and the idea of playing any game on PC always puts the fear of God into me. The PS3 outputs the game at a solid 720p at 30 frames per second. Now this is exactly the same resolution and frame rate as DS1, but unlike his predecessor, it doesn't suffer from frame drops, and the character models and environments are much more detailed. It's a noticeable improvement, but goddamn did it get me cursing EA for not re-releasing it on modern consoles with 1080p 60 FPS support. Now the biggest difference between DS2 and the original is in its presentation. For the most part, it's similar in terms of its HUD and its world design, where diegetic design is key to the experience, but where it differentiates itself is in its set pieces. The game is far more cinematic than its predecessor, and it's not just through the characters you meet and their interactions with Isaac, it's more so the scale, the actions that you take, and their conclusions. The ride you go on is breakneck pace, and it never stops for you to get off. They say bigger isn't always better, but here, in Dead Space 2, it certainly is. There's so many moments I could talk about here, from the hellish eye exam to the HAL 9000's killer AI. It's a game full of twists and turns, where at any point it could descend into over-the-top insanity, but it never does. It stays grounded in its world, and ensures, as a player, you never know what you're going to get into next. It walks a tightrope yet never falters, never slips. It's one of those rare experiences when you finish, you realise you've played a masterpiece. Dead Space 2 is the gold standard of sequels. It took what came before and managed to improve on it in nearly every way. From a likeable cast to abhorrent enemies, it deepens the Dead Space world and yet manages to craft a personal story of guilt and loss that works on every level. Normally, by raising the action you dilute the horror, but here, that couldn't be further from the truth. It deserves its spot as the best survival horror of the 7th generation, and to me, it's one of the best of all time. Dead Space 2 is as impressive today as it was on its launch, and my only wish is to see it come to life on PlayStation with a HD lick of paint. EA of all people are leaving money on the table, and I don't understand why. But if it's been this long, I'm sure that my wishes will go unanswered, and I'll have to wait for the inevitable remake in a few years' time. If for any reason you haven't played Dead Space 2, I implore you to find the time to experience it. You won't regret it. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it and subscribe to the channel for more Dead Space content. Let me know your thoughts on the game. I try to respond to everyone, and I'll look forward to discussing it with you. Up next, I'll be reviewing Motive's Dead Space Remake, so I look forward to seeing you back here soon. Now if you're still craving a bit more from me, consider checking out my podcast In PS We Trust. It's a PlayStation podcast where we crack a few beers and discuss the latest news, rumours and hype for all things PlayStation. You can find it on all podcast services, as well as right here on YouTube. I'll have links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. Downloadable content, in general, is a mixed bag. You've got map packs, skins, new weapons, and the holy grail of them all, story DLC. And with these, you have some which provide a new take on a series, providing a fresh experience which when combined with the base product, lift the overall package. And on the other side of the coin, you have some which have unlimited potential and they squander it, diminishing their vision with reused and recycled content in a quest to stay cost effective. The difficulty is you never quite know what you're going to get. For every great one, there's tons which aren't worth the price, or more importantly, your time. When I finished Dead Space 2 back on its release, I felt content with the experience I had, and more so than that, I was acutely aware this was an EA published game, and in typical EA fashion, they were trying to milk every last penny they could out of the IP, releasing not one, not two, but 3 different content packs, each containing their own suits and weapon skins, and that's on top of the pre-order bonuses or unlocks for playing additional games in the series. And so, when they showed the upcoming story DLC entitled Severed, which would launch 2 months after the base game on the 1st of March 2011 for $6.99 on PS3 and Xbox 360, to say I was dubious would be an understatement, and my suspicions were concreted when the reviews came out, landing a middling 57% on Metacritic. And so, with all this in mind, I passed on it. But all these years later, as I'm reviewing the series, I felt it was right to go back and give it a chance, to see if I was too quick in passing over the experience, or if my original fears were justified. Well, in this review, I'll answer that question. Now, if you haven't played Severed before, there's no need to worry about spoilers. I'll provide timestamps to help you move around them. Now let's dive in. Severed sees the return of 2 familiar characters, Gabe Weller and Lexi Murdoch. You may remember them from the surprisingly awesome light gun game Dead Space Extraction. After surviving the colony of Aegis 7 and their time aboard the USG Ishimura, the 2 survivors settled on the Sprawl, and sometime in the 3 years after the events of Extraction, they married, with Lexine taking the name of Weller. The pair kept quiet about the events on the colony, and as such, they've been left alone to pick up the pieces of their lives and find happiness in each other. That happiness isn't fated to last, as Gabe and his security team are called down to the Titan Mines, where he comes face to face with the kind of reunion that makes my high school one look like the best day of my life.
I've been waiting a long time for this.
You know me, bitch!
Oh, God! I'm a grown goddamn man!
Gabe, realizing that shit is only gonna go downhill, instructs Lexine to head to their shuttle so they can hightail it out of there, as he ignores his orders and moves to find her. And so begins Dead Space Severed. Lasting just over an hour in length, the story here doesn't go too much further than this initial setup. It's a simple case of finding your loved one and getting the hell out of Dodge. And unlike the rest of the series, it doesn't stop to give any additional information. There's no audio logs, diaries, or written lore. It's move forward and don't stop. Now that does wonders for the pacing, as the momentum is dialed up to 11. And I guess this makes sense. Would you really stop to read a document if your loved one is in danger?
Maybe.
To me, it's just kinda lazy. Dead Space 2 is chock full of lore and files, and the pacing doesn't suffer with it. It's one of those breaks in logic that you ignore in video games. The world may be ending, but there's always time to do a spot of chocobo riding, or some meaningless side quest to earn a new piece of armor. Sure, these aren't one-to-one examples, but you get what I'm saying here. Extra lore or backstory for key characters wouldn't ruin the pace or pull us out of the experience. We go along with it. We suspend our disbelief. Including them would give you opportunity to learn more about the couple, deepening the bond you were supposed to feel, and without it, you get that feeling of a rush, but it comes at a cost, and one which feels like a get-out-of-jail-free card for the devs, where they can say they weren't included to add to the realism for the characters, but really, it's due to a lack of care. And the worst thing about it is, this game does need to have some explanation included, as there's moments here that leave you scratching your head. Now I'm going to move this into spoilers just for the moment, but I'll be back to tie all this together shortly. Right near the end of the DLC, we hear about the Oracle program. The gist of this is that they want Lexine to get pregnant so they can study her baby, and that's why she has been designated as a key target for elimination. So what is the Oracle program, and why is it important? Well, jog your mind back to Dead Space Extraction. Remember how the marker was affecting everyone on Aegis 7 and later the Ishimura? Well, not Lexine. She was immune, and this was of big interest to EarthGov.
This is Overseer Eckhart, code word Oracle, with a message for Enigma Lang. Events on Aegis 7 and the Ishimura are extraordinary. The marker is genuine, though its effects are disturbing, and I am blessed to have survived. I have found the subject you were looking for, Lexine Murdoch, a surveyor. She appears immune to the marker's effects, as you predicted. Nobody knows but me. There was a botanist here who suspected my mission, but I've taken care of her.
You son of a bitch!
Now that backstory is fine, if you've played Extraction. If you haven't, you wouldn't have a clue what's going on. And if you want to know even more about the Oracle program, you have to pick up the graphic novel Dead Space Salvage. Now this is a personal bugbear of mine, but I hate it when essential understanding is hidden behind other forms of media. It comes off as pure laziness, when all they needed was a file to explain them. Now while I got you in the spoilers, there's one part here which I want to praise. The ending.
Just following orders.
Lex, Bartlett set off a grenade.
Oh my god!
I'm not gonna make it.
No! That's not possible!
I can blow the bay doors for you from out here. You can get away. You win the baby. I love you, Lex.
Gabe.
I love you.
I didn't see this coming at all, and it genuinely shocked me. My jaw was on the floor. For as little as I ended up caring about Lexine and Gabe's relationship due to his short runtime, to get any sense of surprise here is welcome, and it set up a loose thread which the devs could pull at for the inevitable Dead Space 3 follow-up. Now with hindsight, we know this doesn't actually go anywhere, and as far as my memory goes, we don't encounter Lexine ever again. But who knows, with Dead Space 4 now being a possibility thanks to the remake, this could be the thread which finds a needle. The story told here in Severed is basic, and it remains that way for the duration of the DLC. It provides possibilities for the future, but unfortunately, it leaves potential to provide further insight into EarthGov's shady projects to the wayside, in favour of keeping the pace breakneck. Now in terms of the gameplay and presentation, there isn't too much to talk about here. It's the same as the base game, so there's no point in covering off what I went through in my Dead Space 2 video, and if you want to know how I feel about it, I'd encourage you to watch that nearly 40-minute deep dive. So instead, I'll talk you through some of the differences. In terms of where you travel in Severed, you are on an opposite path to Isaac. Gabe travels from the mines of Titan to meet Lexine in the medical ward, rather than starting in medical and moving through the environment towards the mines. And what's clever is, as you go through the familiar environments, you encounter the aftermath of Isaac's fights. And these put a smile on my face as I reminisce on the set pieces from the base game. I just wish this applied in the inverse, where moments from Severed give fresh insight into what you've seen as Isaac. I'll give you an example here. There's a moment Gabe does battle with a ship, and it crashes. Now if they had thought about it, they could have made the ship crash into another one. And even though this is only a tiny moment in Dead Space 2's environmental storytelling, the fans would have noticed this and put the two together. It's the little things that show care. Like how playing RE3 Remake, you see how the shower room is destroyed from RE2 Remake. They don't need to include it, but it helps you see familiar spaces or events in a fresh new light. It's a small thing, but one that could have been elevated without too much effort. Leaving that to the side, now I've mentioned pace quite a lot over this short review already, but I'll labor the point here. The game does not slow down, not even for a moment. Every room you enter, you get into a fight. It's constant, and due to this, there's no chance for atmosphere or tension to build outside of the knowledge that you will get jumped. You just run or walk through environments with your gun ready, and know you're going to partake in the same combat encounters you've done with Isaac, with no real differences between him and Gabe. And that's the thing, they could have used this as a chance to make the protagonist feel distinct, to give Gabe a new weapon to make him feel completely different. Just imagine they gave him the plasma saw from Dead Space Mobile to partake in some melee combat. Or if they brought back the pistol from Extraction, anything like this would have helped. But no, they played it safe. Now I get it, the general gameplay in Dead Space 2 is incredible, so why fix what isn't broken? But I would have liked to have seen something new here, to take some risks and see if it pays off, and if it did, it would give them opportunity to build this into future sequels. But no, the only new inclusion here is the return of the Twitcher from the original Dead Space. Seeing them return was nice, and it certainly provided ample challenge when combined with the many enemies in Dead Space 2, but to me, that's not enough. It's wild that a title like Dead Space Mobile is so chock full of creative passion and new ideas, whereas the only story DLC for Dead Space 2 feels like well-trodden ground. It's a waste of potential. And that summarizes this game. It's one where it's a full-on adrenaline ride, and that's it. Severed doesn't add much of anything to the series, with no changes to gameplay and not enough time to make you care about its characters. But if you just want to play more Dead Space 2 and have fun for an hour, then I guess it delivers that. It's not an essential experience by any means, and at $6.99, it's a lot to ask for what is throwaway content. But in saying that, as the gameplay for Dead Space 2 is at such high caliber, it's always fun to engage with combat, even if that's all there is. Younger me was right to give this a wide berth. If I had been excited to dive into this experience having waited 2 months from launch for new Dead Space content, I would have come away from it disappointed. But going in on a whim with middling expectation, I did find some enjoyment here. I suppose you need to make a judgment call if $6.99 is worth it for an hour's content. That's up to you, but personally, I feel you could spend that same sum on any number of worthwhile experiences and come away from them feeling like you've got your fill. With Severed, you're only going to finish it hungry for more. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it and subscribe for more Dead Space content. Let me know your thoughts on Severed in the comments. I try to respond to everyone, so I'll look forward to discussing it with you. Up next, I'll be covering Dead Space Remake before I move on to Dead Space 3, and I look forward to seeing you back here for then. If you're still craving a bit more from me, and you're a fan of PlayStation, consider checking out my podcast In PS We Trust. It's a show where we go through all the latest news, rumours and hype, while drinking excessively. It's not good for my liver, but it makes for an entertaining time. I'll have links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. Dead Space 3 was developed by Visceral and published by EA, releasing on the 5th of February 2013 for PS3, Xbox 360, and Windows. On the build-up to its release, the hype was real. Dead Space 1 was a revelation, and its follow-up had fast become the face of horror on the 7th generation of consoles. So when the rumour mill started up on what Dead Space 3 had in store for us, with Isaac and a shadow version of him playable in co-op, which would showcase the mental fatigue our main lad was under, I was frothing with anticipation. Flash forward a few months to E3 2012, and we finally got a first look. A story trailer followed by a live on-stage demo. The story detail had been way out, but the broad strokes were bang on the money. A full co-op experience as Isaac leaves the confines of a mining vessel and a space station, and instead heads to an icy planet to uncover the origins of the markers. The marketing guys at EA got me hook, line and sinker. And this was only compounded when I got my hands on a demo in the January of 2013, where I could finally experience co-op action with a good friend. If only this honeymoon period could have lasted, as by the time the game arrived and I was done with it, I remember walking away from the experience feeling like I'd just been backhanded. The sting of disappointment was a cruel mistress, and one that stayed with me for years. So when I was faced with returning to Dead Space 3, to say I was apprehensive would be an understatement. But with the passing of time, I was hopeful that maybe it wasn't as bad as I remembered. After all, since doing these reviews, there's been countless times that I've realised how much my opinion has changed, and I prayed, hoped, and dreamed that I would walk away 10 years later a changed man. A man who would shout from the rooftops how great Dead Space 3 is, how it's criminally underrated and deserves your time. But sadly, after finishing the game, that dream is nothing short of a nightmare. Dead Space 3 is a disappointment, and this review I'm going to explain why that is, the impact studio interference has on what could be a great game, and how Visceral has thrown away everything that makes the Dead Space series special to chase wider mass appeal. As usual, this review will be split into plot, gameplay and presentation, and for those that haven't played Dead Space 3 before, don't worry, I'll be keeping this light on spoilers. Now let's dive in. DS3 begins on the icy planet of Tau Volantis in 2314. A necromorph outbreak is in full swing, and we fill the boots of Sovereign Colony's armed forces soldiers Tim Kaufman and Sam Ackerman, as they are sent searching for the Codex, a device powerful enough to end the nightmare which has engulfed the colony. After surviving multiple run-ins with the recently deceased, and the force of Mother Nature herself, we soon learn that it's all been in vain. The research expedition they're taking part in has gotten out of hand, and the only option left is containment.
You love the Earth, son. Your mom and dad. Yes, sir, of course. Good. Glad to hear that.
With that bleak view into the past, the game flash forwards 200 years, and we find our main man Isaac Clarke living on the New Horizons lunar colony. It's been 3 years since the events on Titan Station, and since then, Isaac has been in hiding from EarthGov alongside Ellie Langford. But due to Isaac's inability to move on with his life, and Ellie wanting to seek out and end the marker's influence across the stars, Isaac has lost her, and in turn, everything he cares about, and he wallows in self-pity. The pity party is cut short when Isaac is joined by some unexpected visitors, bringing with them news that communication with Ellie has been lost. And as an expert on markers, only Isaac can find her and help complete their mission to save the world. Before he has time to tell them where to stick it, explosions rock the lunar colony as unitologist fanatics led by Jacob Arthur Danik seek to find Isaac and bring him to justice for destroying 2 markers which in their mind denied humanity its ascension. This bombastic opening sets the pace for what's to come across the story of Dead Space 3. It's Isaac and Carver versus Unitology, as the inner circle of the religion close in around every corner as the duo strive to end the marker's influence for good. The plot of Dead Space 3 has a lot of spinning plates. You have the interpersonal relationships of Isaac, Carver, Ellie and the rest of the crew, the introduction of the inner circle and their militaristic style of Unitology, the events that happened 200 years ago on Tau Volantis, and finally, the purpose of the markers and their ultimate goal. It's a lot. Now, the reason for this increase in scope is unfortunately a result of EA and Visceral's vision going into the game. Visceral had always intended to end the series on the third entry, and as such, they felt like they had to answer some of the burning questions that underpin the franchise. They felt they could no longer seed the ground. It was time for a harvest. And the unfortunate reality is this is delivered at the expense of the wider cast. Now, is it due to the sheer amount of characters DS3 tries to juggle? Potentially. I mean, the cast here is much larger than the two characters we had with us in DS1 and 2. The third entry chucks 6 our way. 6! And within this, we have 2 playable protagonists, a love triangle, and a betrayal. It's one hell of a lot. And those spinning plates soon begin to fall. Danik, the main protagonist, fails to add any intrigue or mystique into the experience. Ellie and Isaac's relationship happens, but the connection between them doesn't create any emotional attachment. And Carver's entire story is relegated to co-op side missions which, if playing solo, make him redundant. I just wish that Visceral had gone into this with tempered scope and focused on the most important aspects of the franchise, the mystery and the characters. The first game is the story of the Ishimura. The second game is the story of Isaac overcoming his demons. And the third is a story about everything fucking else. By bloating to this extent, it dabbles into everything, but never focuses, ending up becoming a sea of noise with no clear voice. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some high points. The lore in both document and audio logs are vast. The environmental storytelling told through the world is intriguing, but it fails at the basics, creating characters I don't care about, and turning the whole religion of Unitology from what felt like an immovable repressive force in the other games into a physical threat which can be tricked, evaded, and overcome with relative ease. Jesus Christ, the amount of times Danik has Isaac in his grasp, only to go on a typical bad guy monologue and let him escape, is mind-blowing. He's incompetent, a complete moron, a fucking Tory.
Isaac, as you can personally attest...
Fuck off.
There's so much I could talk through when it comes to this plot, but the main issue comes back to one thing: scale. And by trying to include everything to tie the franchise up, they ended up undercutting what it needed to do, which was deliver an emotionally engaging story. Dead Space 3 sticks true to what the series is known for, with stasis, kinesis, and an assortment of tools to bring destruction to the hordes of necromorphs which hide around every corner. But there's a number of changes which separate DS3 from the other entries in the series. For starters, and the one that has the biggest impact on the overall experience, the game is fully playable in co-op.
Yay!
And its inclusion hurts more than it helps. Now, before I get into why this is, I'll give you a bit of background on why it was included in the first place. And, spoiler alert, it's all EA's fault. Work on Dead Space 3 began in 2011. Dead Space 2 had released to glorious praise, but even with reviewers and fans alike basking in how great the experience was, EA wasn't happy. The game had failed to match their lofty sales goals, and they didn't have to look far to see what success could look like. So did they do the wise thing? Double down on what makes the series unique? Slash the sales goals and dial it down to a smaller experience to make it stand out from its contemporaries?
I didn't do fucking shit!
They said, more action, less horror, and for good measure, chuck in microtransactions. Everyone loves those. It's obvious how Resident Evil's success 2 years prior influenced Dead Space 3, but whereas Resident Evil 5 in many ways grew from what came before in Resident Evil 4, Dead Space 3 cut so many corners to make its vision work, it feels like a half-baked version of what came before. So I've danced around it long enough. What did adding co-op impact? Well, there's two major things. For starters, having another player with you gives you solace. It's no longer you versus the world. You've got someone to watch your back. And this sense of relief destroys any tension, fear, and atmosphere the game tries to create. Which, for what is an action horror series that relied on its atmosphere, its absence is sorely missed. The second and most damaging impact co-op has to the experience is the lack of interactivity. Kinesis has always been an ability with which you can grab basically any item around the environment, from dead necromorph blades to bins, lobbing them at supersonic speed to cripple the enemies and in turn save resources. In DS3, this is scaled back dramatically, with the only items affected by kinesis being necroblades or explosive canisters. The environment is like when you take a kid into a gift shop. You can look, but you can't touch. Now I assume this is a result of having two playable characters inhabiting one area. Two loads of kinesis moving and shaking the environment would put too much strain on the game engine, resulting in dropped frames or straight crashes. And the evidence for this is clear as day, as corpses of your enemies disappear before your eyes, leading to moments where you go to grab a necroblade, only for the target to vanish, resulting in a miskinesis and an opportunity to deal hefty damage. It's such a shame, as by scaling back on kinesis's environmental interaction, it shatters any immersion the game is trying to create. For every failed grab, I was reminded I was playing a game with set rules, and it felt like a true backstep from what was standard all the way back in 2008. Now there is one choice which I did appreciate with the co-op inclusion, and that's the asymmetrical dementia. Across the game, both Isaac and Carver will experience visions thanks to the marker's influence, and the great thing is, only the one character will be able to see those. There's an entire side objective plot built around Carver's family, which is where this mechanic truly shines. Carver may simply be standing still, but through the headset my co-op buddy was able to explain what he was seeing, and my only job was to cover his ass as he confronted Carver's inner demons. It's a great idea, both consistent with the wider series and more importantly, one which promotes multiple playthroughs to be able to experience each character's unique visions. And it adds purpose to the side objectives, which are built into the vast majority of missions, rewarding those who partake in them with fresh challenges or character pieces that make them worth your time. And speaking of challenge, thanks to having double the firepower, Dead Space 3 gives the necromorphs added durability and more importantly, speed to close down on our heroes. Now to offset this, they introduce a dodge. With a double tap of R2, Isaac will roll. This dodge can be performed in 4 directions, and it's chock full of iframes. Now, I have to admit, it never got old rolling out of the way of a jumping necromorph, popping up and blowing them to Kingdom Come. I'm a sucker for a skillful use of a dodge or a parry in near enough every game they can be included in. But what makes this mechanic shine is the impact of getting it wrong, the damage you take by not reacting in time, and the regret that is singed into every fibre of your being. Unfortunately, Dead Space 3 doesn't commit to this. The game throws health kits at you like there's no tomorrow. and if you somehow use them all up, you can craft them for bugger all. The amount of healing items on hand at any one time degrade the mechanical challenge of perfect play, and to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that people got through the experience without ever using the dodge, as going blow for blow in Necros is now a viable strategy for success. The final two changes I'll mention here are with the weapons and the in-game economy. Let's start with the weapons. In the previous two mainline entries, Isaac had access to 4 weapons at any one time. Each one served a specific purpose, giving a primary attack and an alternate fire, which would change how that weapon could be used. For example, a plasma caster had its standard fire, with its alternate used to switch between a horizontal or vertical axis for targeted dismemberment. A pulse rifle would allow for sustained fire, and its ult would give a grenade launcher for quick kills or, more importantly, crowd control. The joy was in figuring out which gun suited your style, the specific best use scenario, and having a mix which could be swapped to at any given time to overcome the approaching threat. And all this while managing the individual ammo counts for each weapon, forcing you to save up your more powerful caches for when the need is dire. Dead Space 3 does things its own way. It introduces weapon crafting. By visiting one of the many crafting tables across the game, Isaac can create 2 individual weapons to carry around at any one time. These guns are created by finding blueprints, which then can be mixed with different attachments to augment their purpose. Each individual gun can be mixed and tailored to whatever the player sees fit. Do you like the line gun, but wish you had a shotgun for close encounters? Go for it. Do you want an element gun, whereby you freeze the enemy in place and then melt them with a flamethrower? Sure. The choice on offer is insane, giving the player the ability to fuse the iconic arsenal of the previous 2 games into world-ending Deathbringers. And that's all well and good, but the issue is, when you've created your perfect gun, your magnum opus, there's no need for any further experimentation. For me, that gun was a javelin gun, which I augmented into a machine gun, firing out devastating javelins at turbo speed, and then, when I wanted to end something immediately, I had a rocket launcher with 0 splash damage, so I could essentially hit the nuke button whenever I felt like it. It was absolutely busted. Now the logical person would think, well, there must be some reason to mix up the styles like there was in the first 2 games. There must be something to stop me just blasting everything to Kingdom Come with the rocket launcher whenever I feel like it. And yeah, the answer would be different ammo caches just like in the previous games. But logic doesn't seem to fit in with Dead Space 3, as here, they've done away with this, streamlining ammunition into a shared resource across all guns. This change means there's no need to manage your stocks, to think about when to use a specific type. You can fire anything you want until your heart's content, and if you somehow start running low, you can craft additional rounds for essentially nothing at the crafting tables. In giving the player more choice up front with fully customizable guns, in reality, it reduces choice, as now you have a maximum of 2 guns with 2 alternate fires, reducing the choice of how you engage from 8 firing types to 4. And as resources shared across them, you might as well just build one gun which can do everything, and stick with it for the entire experience. There's no need to be tactical, to manage your ammo stock, to use the right tool for each encounter, as you've custom made a tool which can do it all. Now I like the idea of building your own personal gun which can fully support your playstyle, but with no downsides to using this gun in perpetuity, it actively reduces any decision making in moment-to-moment gameplay. It's a damn shame, as to make this crafting system work, it needs to be built into every element of the game, and that's where the in-game economy comes in. The previous entries relied on credits. The simple premise was you find these across the environment or by killing enemies, and you would use them to either buy resources in the form of health kits or ammo, or you could sink your credits into nodes to make your existing kit more powerful. And if you wanted more credits, you'd have to sell off your health and ammo to get more. It promoted a choice in how low you run yourself on these vital resources to allow the player to scale up on the upgrades to match newer, more powerful enemies which would appear the further into the experience you go. This system worked without issue in both Dead Space 1 and 2, but with the introduction of weapon crafting, DS3 had an opportunity to try something new. It binned off credits and replaced them with components. Now there's far too many here to break down each individual component, but the basic gist is some can be broken down from your health and ammo to allow for health upgrades or armor upgrades for your suit, but the vast majority are found by using a scavenger robot, which will find random amounts upon its return to a crafting station, and these can then be used to make new gun parts or unlock additional circuits for upgrading the weapon even further. To me, this extra complication into the in-game economy solely exists to promote microtransactions. You see, each scavenger bot takes approximately 10 minutes to return, and when it does and you get everything bar the one material you really need, you can choose to pass over this entire system and buy the resources using real-world currency on the PlayStation Store. Now, I never felt the urge to do it, and instead would just send the bot out time after time in the hopes of something coming in I actually needed. It was a chore, and felt like busy work rather than a way to deepen the experience. The question I asked myself while writing this is, did the economy work better in DS1 and 2, with the choice on how quickly you power up depends on your play and how much risk you want to take by limiting resources, or RNG, where you send out a bot and hope for the best? The answer is obvious. A gameplay-centric economy which underpins every action you take serves the game. One which is created with a backdoor to bypass partaking in it entirely is as transparent as a pane of glass. My mind is drawn to one conclusion. EA must have mandated this change, and all it's done is provide extra confusion, more busy work, and move away from what works so flawlessly in the previous titles. I like how DS3 tried new things for the franchise, introducing co-op, adding full weapon customization, but it's like as if it did these by using a monkey's paw. Each new addition has unintended consequences which pull Dead Space 3 further away from what came before, and unintentionally take away from the experience, rather than add to it. Now I realise over the course of this review, every positive I've stated has then been partially, if not all the way, undone by its negatives. And well, that isn't going to change in the presentation front. Let's start with the positives. Returning to score the game are composers Jason Greaves and James Hannigan, and it's in this entry that I feel the musical accompaniment reaches its crescendo. The vistas across the game are extraordinary, from the frozen tundra of Tau Volantis to the minefield in orbit above the planet, and it's here that the soundtrack is given room to rise to the surface. In all the action, it's hard to pinpoint its presence, but in the quiet moments, its majesty stops you in its tracks. It's spectacular. This stellar score is backed up by performances from all the cast which sell its characters. Now, as stated in the plot section, the writing doesn't do them justice, with most of the cast feeling cookie cutter, or at best, half-baked. But the cast believe in who they are playing, and the performances shine through the dullness. Now, speaking of characters, eagle-eyed viewers might have picked up on a change with one in particular.
Captain, is this him?
Oh, nice lovely new eye.
You dirty, dirty bastard.
Now, as I stated earlier, the vistas across the game are incredible. But for the most part, the majority of the game, you'll be dealing with small corridors leading into box rooms, where every opportunity, a vent will break, and a necromorph will appear behind you, rushing for your blood. It's the same setup as the Ishimura, and so on paper, I shouldn't have an issue, right?
Wrong.
The difference is, in DS1, atmosphere is king. The environments and layouts were similar, but each area had a feel, a sense of lingering dread, and the set dressing that accompanied each area brought it to life. In DS3, you may explore a decrepit ship, an ice planet, a cityscape, but there's no reason to absorb your surroundings, to take things slow, to feel fear. You feel in control, powerful, and so each area you progress through at pace, rolling through doors and joking with your partner over in-game chat. There's no chance for the game to breathe and create the tension which would make the game ascend above a boilerplate third-person shooter. And the killing blow for Dead Space 3 here, this is the first time that entire segments of maps are repeated. Now I swear I saw the same icy dead end where I could use a scavenger bot time after time throughout Tau Volantis. And no, it wasn't because I was running in circles. This same square is used time after goddamn time. And without effective atmosphere to draw you deeper into the world, the entire experience feels less ambitious and more lazy. Like corners were cut to provide on-paper expansive variety. Now I played the game through on the PS3, and as such it meant I experienced the game in glorious 720p 30 FPS. And I'm glad to say, the game ran perfectly. I experienced no drop in frame rate across the entire experience. And as much as I have dunked on the environments being generic or lacking interaction, the game itself is still beautiful to look at. The vacuum of space and the snowy tundra on the planet itself both look incredible. And when the action intensifies, there are some incredibly beautiful shots. This moment in particular stood out as one which physically made me gasp in delight. Now if you have an Xbox Series or PC, I'd imagine those would be the best way to experience the game today, as DS3 has been upscaled to provide better frame rates and higher resolutions. But if you're like me and want an authentic experience, the PS3 or Xbox 360 is still a great choice. And with drop-in, drop-out co-op available through peer-to-peer connection, it's great to see the main draw of Dead Space 3 is still intact all these years later. Now it does baffle me why EA refused to put out 4K or even HD versions of the original trilogy onto modern platforms. But with the success of Dead Space Remake, he is hoping we get to experience 2 and 3 with a fresh coat of paint and new ideas to refine and elevate what was here as a base experience. Because one thing's for certain, Dead Space 3 certainly needs it. Dead Space 3 is a game which does things differently. It introduces a new way for us to play with seamless co-op, side objectives for those that want new challenges or to uncover more of Carver's past. It provides a new weapon crafting system, and it does all this while trying to tie the series up. Unfortunately, with all this change, it can't capture the magic which made Dead Space 1 and 2 masters of the action horror genre. Something was lost in the mix, and the consequence was a loss of atmosphere. And for Dead Space, that's a critical component that without it degrades the experience to nothing more than a basic third-person shooter. For my money, Visceral bit off more than they can chew here, and in trying to rush to the end of the story, they threw away what made the series so unique. The mystery was gone, the characters were weak, and the plot, upon finishing the game, doesn't offer the closure which many were expecting. Now, there is a final piece of DLC in Dead Space 3 Awakened, which, to this day, I've never experienced. So maybe that's where the full story comes to a decisive end. But to me, a game should stand on its own. It shouldn't need DLC to tie things up in a neat package. And I leave Dead Space 3 feeling much like I did going in. The game is a disappointment. A bum note in what had been a flawless series in the previous 2 entries. And it was no wonder the series was left floating in the void of space, seemingly in permanent hibernation following this outing. Thankfully, there is hope. With Motive's Dead Space remake, the series has the best chance in living again, and I hope the team have a chance to take what was here as a base game and fully re-envision it, to take its core ideas and see them through to their full potential. But we'll have a long wait to see if this potential future comes to pass. That brings this review to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, then don't forget to put a like on it and consider subscribing for more Dead Space content. Up next on the channel, I'll be experiencing Dead Space 3 Awakened for the first time, so make sure to hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Now, if you're still craving a bit more from me, consider checking out my podcast, In PS We Trust. It's a PlayStation podcast where me and my co-host discuss the latest news, rumours and hype for all things PlayStation, and of course, survival horror. It's available on all major podcast services and right here on YouTube. I'll leave links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. Awakened is the only piece of story DLC released for Dead Space 3, gracing the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC a little over a month after the main game on March 12, 2013. Following my playthrough of Dead Space 3 and the disappointment which leached into every fibre of my being, I saw the DLC and swiftly avoided it. Well, here we are 10 years later. And as I've been reviewing the entire series, I thought it was time to put things right and give it a shot. And after finishing it some 90 minutes later, I'm surprised to say it's actually great. Now, as the game is a DLC addition to Dead Space 3, it would be redundant to go into the same depth on the systems that make Dead Space 3 Dead Space 3. If you want the full breakdown, it's best to check out my full review of the base game, which you can find here. For this review, I'm going to explain what makes this DLC stand out, and why it's worth your time. Now let's dive in. Now before we get into the nitty gritty, let's set the scene for the ending on Dead Space 3. So, if you don't want spoilers for that game, I'd suggest skipping to the timestamp shown. Dead Space 3 ended with the Brethren moon crashing into Tau Volantis. Ellie sits in her ship overlooking a geological disaster zone. Nothing could have survived. Isaac and Carver have sacrificed themselves to end the Necromorph pandemic for good. Or have they? Our heroes wake up on Tower of Atlantis with a chronic case of Batman-esque plot armor, and as Isaac explains it himself,
Aren't we dead? That doesn't make any sense!
I quit trying to make sense of it all back on the Ishimura.
Nice.
With that meaty explanation, Awaken begins. Now fortunately, with the destruction of the moon, the necromorphs are gone. Or are they? Well, if nothing else, the threat of the unitologist is over thanks to the... Oh wait.
Oh shit. Here we go again.
So everything is the same as the base game. Okay. If you haven't guessed it by now, the setup of DS3 Awakened doesn't make an awful lot of sense. It skates over its setup and the finer plot points which come to pass in a flash. The biggest example I can think of here is with the twisted threat across this DLC. The Circle are back. But this time, it's different. No longer focused on simply freeing markers to incite convergence following Danik's death, a whole new version of Unitology focused on worshipping the necromorphs themselves has spread like wildfire. This cult seek to embody the necromorph form, fusing flesh from their victims onto their bodies in ritualistic ceremonies, mutilating the living with useless appendages torn from the dead. Now, did this offshoot always exist in the background, lurking just beneath the veil of order the Circle portrayed, clawing to the surface with the fall of their leader? No, they literally started doing this about an hour ago. Now, could it be due to the Brethren Moon's influence being so strong across space and time? I mean, I guess, but who really knows? It just happens, and the best thing to do with the entire plot shown across Awakened is just to go with it. Lasting approximately 90 minutes, the DLC is a non-stop rollercoaster ride. You move from area to area, blasting Necros to Kingdom Come, and the guns that you made in the main game have come to party, as here, they can be upgraded with even more powerful upgrade circuits, boosting the absurd damage you were capable of by the end of the base game to record heights. Now, it's important to note, all the complaints I leveraged at Dead Space 3 obviously return here. The gun crafting at this point in the story is pointless, as what you've created is already world-ending, so there's no reason to explore and seek out something new, and if you wanted to, well, tough. Visceral didn't include an option to do this anyway. The DLC is a very linear experience, where you continue moving forward to try and get off the planet and return home before disaster strikes. There's no other goal. There's no side missions, nothing to dissuade you from continuing to move on. So with a lack of detail applied to the plot, and a base gameplay experience which is the same as the base game, why did I enjoy this so much? Well, it's all thanks to that cult I mentioned earlier. The Brethren Moons are in full swing, and the effects on our protagonists are a heavy dose of delusion. Across the experience, Isaac is teleported to a haunting vision of the Earth, surrounded by Brethren Moons, and it's here that the game throws it back to the ending of Dead Space 2. The Pack return, and they are here in shadow form, and the only way to escape this vision is to destroy a glowing marker. While this is happening for Isaac, Carver is left to try and defend your physical body as you try to regain control of your sanity. Now, as the DLC continues, these delusions become more and more pronounced, and it's within these that you get some great little moments. In a handful, they'll have necromorphs appear and disappear in a flash, with the player never really knowing if they are real or a trick of the mind, forcing you to fire at everything just to be safe. In others, they introduce the main physical threat of the DLC, the cult leader. This prophet appears as soon as Isaac and Carver arrive on the Terra Nova, and they bear witness to the sheer lunacy which has overtaken the Circle. Appearing in vision form, The cult leader is a stand-in for the Terminator. All you can do is avoid him, dodging out of the way of his knife as he menacingly approaches, warping in and out of your eye line as you contend with a horde of enemies. It's extremely menacing, and as he appears so frequently, even with such a short runtime, he becomes a core component of what separates the DLC from the main game, and I adored his inclusion. The increased dementia attacks not only provide context for how powerful the moons are, they also give Visceral opportunity to spice up combat encounters with inventive ways. Even though every single one is in a square box of different sizes, they feel unique, as each one has a different gimmick or visual flair brought on by the marker's influence. By basing this entire concept around a character in the Prophet, it gave this threat a physical presence which worked a lot better than Danik ever did in the base game. Now, I said this a lot in my DS3 review, and I'm going to repeat it here. Dead Space is a series built on atmosphere, and by focusing on the asymmetrical dementia, they finally deliver on what Dead Space 3 could have provided. At times, it's just dumb fun, but in others, there is tension, and that's something that wasn't anywhere across the 14 hours it took me to complete the main game. This 90-minute action-packed blockbuster may be light on story. Hell, it throws logic and reason out of the window, glossing over plot holes with a sly, smug smile. But it works, and I left the experience feeling like I just witnessed a revelation. This is what Dead Space 3 could have been if Visceral had just been left to their own devices without EA trying everything they could to drag the series away from its action horror roots. Now, unfortunately, there is a couple of major caveats that I want to talk through when it comes to this DLC package. For starters, as this released only a month after the base game, I can only assume that this content was completed and done by the time DS3 launched, with EA mandating it to be cut out and sold separately to milk the fans of the franchise one last time to try and maximize profit. It is a sting, as if you want to see the true ending for Dead Space 3 and the potential future which a possible fourth entry could explore, you'll need to shell out $7.99, and for what is a short experience, it's insanely overpriced. Now, I get it. Back in 2013, the rules on what is acceptable and what isn't when it comes to DLC were largely unknown. Publishers and developers were trying everything they could to nickel and dime their players, with EA being one of, if not, the worst publishers for this practice. But that's no excuse. As far as I can see it, Visceral and EA had two choices with this content. Either include it in with the base game to end the experience on a high point, which, potentially, could have left a sweet taste in the mouth of fans who wanted an experience more reminiscent of what we had in the previous two entries. Or, failing that, if it really couldn't be included on launch, then release the pack for free a month later to reward the fans for supporting the series throughout the previous two entries, and in turn, get them to rally around a future fourth entry. It's madness. I am a huge fan of the Dead Space series, buying every game and supporting them with purchases of various supplemental media as they marked the upcoming mainline games. But with DS3 not hitting the mark, and then having to pay what was a large price back in 2013 money, I walked away and didn't see the true ending for Dead Space as a series until now. It's wild, and if that happened to me, I can't imagine how many other fans did the same. Now, speaking for myself here, if I had known what fate awaited Isaac and Carver as they returned towards Earth, I would have been screaming for a fourth entry in the series, to see where this story could have gone. As it happened, I just accepted the series was done, and it had gone out on a whimper. I would remark things like, "Oh, I love Dead Space 1 and 2 anyway." It was easier to try and push DS3 out of my mind and reminisce on the great experiences the franchise had provided, safe in the knowledge that nothing else was on the horizon, that the series I adored wouldn't have to degrade itself any further. But after playing this, I'm reminded how much of a shame it is that Visceral have gone the way that Dodo. Dead Space has so much potential, and my only hope, my only dream, is that Motive, the makers of the Dead Space remake, are given license to explore the future of this series, to see the story to its true end point, be that the death of Isaac or the death of the Necromorphs themselves. I'm sure we'll have a long wait till we find out what's next on the roadmap. Will it be Dead Space 2 remake, or will they skip over 2 and 3 and dive into a 4 to give fans who have patiently waited on a cliffhanger ending for 10 plus years a resolution? I guess we'll have to be patient a little while longer. Now, in wrapping up this mini review, Dead Space 3 Awakened, is it worth your time? Yes, it certainly is. It may be a short, limited experience, but it manages to entertain throughout, and I left it wanting more, and for me, I'll take that over slogging through an experience which never seems to end any day of the week. The price may be high, the practice of it even existing in the first place separately from the base game is questionable, but if you were like me and walked away from the franchise without ever experiencing Awakened, I'd implore you to check it out. You won't regret it. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it and consider subscribing to the channel for more Dead Space and survival horror content. Have you played Awakened? Let me know your thoughts on the game in the comments section. I try to respond to everyone, so I look forward to discussing it with you. Up next, I'll be ending the Dead Space series with a review on Motive's Dead Space remake, so I hope to see you back here soon. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya. The original Dead Space is a classic, a certified masterpiece. Hell, I recently reviewed it and it held up incredibly well. So, when I first learned that this gem was going to be remade from the ground up by EA and Motive, I was hyped to see the franchise return. But I was also dubious on how a reimagining could so easily fall under the shadow of its original and stay there. We've all seen it before. Games which get remade, and sure they look better, but in making the jump to better hardware, they lose the identity, the core of what made the original so fantastic in the first place. I'm looking at you, Twin Snakes. And this is the thing, we aren't in the early 2000s anymore. We have had countless remakes at this point, and the way I see it is they generally fit into 3 camps. You have the games which aim to reimagine the original, changing key aspects of its story or mechanics to make it more accessible to modern audiences, to make it fit better within an established lore. These are the remakes that are often divisive in any given fanbase, as aspects of the original that were so beloved are tossed to the wayside while they focus their attention on newer additions to the experience. Secondly, we have games which seek to stay eternally faithful to the original, keeping the same gameplay and in some cases, even retaining the jank which made the original so memorable, and they focus every resource solely on its presentation. And then you have the cream of the crop, the one above all, Resident Evil Remake. In my mind, the perfect way to execute a remake. Originally releasing only 6 years after the original, this remake retains the same core gameplay, but expands on it, adding new mechanics, new items, new enemies, and it takes the time to add additional lore and modes. And all of this together make the remake the definitive way to experience Resident Evil 1. Now, it's been 21 years since it released, and it was beginning to look like it would remain in a bracket all on its own for the rest of time, until Dead Space Remake came out and blew me away. This review, I'm going to detail why Motive's Dead Space is one of the best remakes of all time. Now, as usual, I will be splitting this review into plot, gameplay, and presentation, and for those that haven't had the time to visit the USG Ishimura, don't worry, I'll provide timestamps to help you avoid any spoilers. Now let's dive in. As a remake, the story of Dead Space has been retold for a new generation of gamer, and it's very faithful, bringing the same major plot points and overarching themes from Visceral's 2008 masterpiece. And as I only reviewed the OG a few months ago, it'll be redundant to cover off the full plot again. Instead, I'm going to use this section to talk about the changes, and how Motive have managed to improve on what was already a near perfect narrative. For starters, let's go for the low-hanging fruit. Isaac is no longer mute. This was a major critique in my original review. Making him a silent protagonist ensured that his character didn't have a chance to form. He was essentially a blank slate we could portray ourselves onto, and if it wasn't for the iconic design of his armor, there's no shot he would have survived in our mind's eye all these years later. The plot is full of twists, turns, and unfathomable horrors around every corner, and yet Isaac would be stoic, and this meant that when he looked back at the original Dead Space, the story and character of the tale is the Ishimura's, not Isaac's. Sure, there's personal stakes with his search for Nicole, but without any facial animation and lack of voice acting, it's hard to feel what the character is. The times when it wants you to have an emotional response, it's borderline jarring how quickly he seemingly gets over the events, which have transpired 30 or so seconds ago. And when it comes to objective setting, there's no room for discussion in a one-way conversation. Isaac was told where to go and what to do by Hammond and Daniels, and he got it done. He was essentially a little bitch. Flash forward to now, and with the addition of voice acting for our main hero, it gives opportunity for the whole crew to feel useful. It's no longer the Isaac go here fix this mission. Now, the crew can converse, plan, and split up to achieve overarching objectives. Sure, it's essentially the same, with Isaac having to do the vast majority of the legwork, but it doesn't feel like it's dictated. It feels natural, given Isaac's skill set and that of the surrounding cast. It feels believable. If being surrounded by reanimated corpses on a death trap of a spaceship is believable, but you get my drift here. Having actual conversation about the task at hand and who does what makes it feel that everyone is contributing to the goal at hand. Speaking of goals, Remake adds 3 side objectives which you slowly work towards as you progress through the narrative. The first of these is crucial to Isaac's personal drive on board the Ishimura. His sole reason for wanting to take this mission, to find Nicole. Nicole in the original popped up here and there throughout the story in the form of a central video log, and then towards the latter half as she aids Isaac to return the marker back to the planet's surface. But we learnt very little about her character. In Remake, Isaac is tasked with tracking down her whereabouts, and he does this by uncovering video logs which document her time on board during the initial uncovering of the marker, and the consequences of bringing it on board. We see her interact with other key players. We see her uncover what is happening to her fellow crewmates, and her keen instincts on Unitology's place amongst all this chaos. These logs are incredible. For the first time, the player and Isaac share the same drive to find her, and even though they aren't the driving force for the narrative, they share as much weight for our hero, and for the first time, us. Isaac's survival may be number 1, but Nicole is 100% number 2. Now, when the game released, I saw a lot of pushback on the design for Nicole in Remake. And as someone that has stand for sexy Nicole as the sole reason why Isaac would force himself through this hellhole, I feel I need to address something. Pour out a drink, lads. super hot fire Nicole is gone, and I sympathise with all the twinks out there. But the truth is, you need to grow the fuck up. Now, we have Cougar Nicole, and as a man in my 30s, let me tell you, with age comes experience. That real toe curler shit.
Oh, shit!
Okay, sorry about that. Let's put this back to the review. On the subject of side objectives, what better way to flesh out lore that until now is left to fan speculation than the enemy most likely to cause diuretic discharge, the Hunter. We knew it was made by Dr. Mercer, but how did the creature come to be? Well, after the first encounter with this abomination, the mystery can be unravelled. Each step you take in the quest for knowledge sheds light on just how psychotic the Doctor is. The horrific experiments conducted offering a deeper gaze into the psyche of a character we all love to hate. The great thing about both of these two objectives is how by following the main narrative, you won't need to step too far out of your way to partake in these objectives, and with the payoff being as great as it is, you'll be foolish to pass over them. Now these side missions have both been incredible additions that fans new and old can find joy in completing, but what about those that want an extra reason to dive back into New Game Plus, outside of trophies and new suits? Well, Motive have you covered. In New Game Plus, there's brand new collectibles dotted around each chapter, and when all the marker fragments are found, you are treated to a brand new, alternate ending. Talk about going above and beyond. To give fans new lore, deeper insight into two key characters, and an extra reason to replay in New Game Plus. But to me, the biggest improvement to the plot is one I never saw coming. And for this, I'll need to move it into spoiler territory, so skip ahead to the timestamp shown if you are keeping this spoiler free. In Hydrophonics, we meet Elizabeth Cross. In the original, we only had glimpses of her thanks to audio diaries, whereas in Remake, we get to meet her in person. It's here that Isaac gets a glimpse of someone whose objective mirrors his own, finding their loved one. Working together throughout this chapter, the two manage to clear the corruption poisoning the air supply, and they separate to find their significant others. Or so you think. In my many playthroughs of Dead Space, I always wondered how an illusion of Nicole could control machinery, why we had to protect a psychosis-driven impersonation of a person who wasn't even there in the first place. And so, when the big reveal of Nicole's suicide came to fruition, I would make up my own headcanon on how Isaac was really doing both parts, but seeing one. I just accepted it as a don't think too hard on this moment. Like time travel in Back to the Future or Avengers Endgame. Just go along with it and enjoy the ride. In Remake, Elizabeth Cross fills a much bigger role. Here, you are seeing her as Nicole, and she is seeing you as Jacob. Those times you're working together now make perfect sense. And when Kendra reveals all of this to you and the illusion is shattered, I was stunned. What a perfect idea! The marker's influence across the entire game is much more prominent than that of the original, and to see the power this artifact has on Isaac's psyche, to make him do its bidding, is incredible. That's the thing I adore about what Motive have done here. They haven't simply repeated what was here as a base game with prettier graphics. They've taken extra care to fill in plot holes, provide additional lore, and tie the first entry into bigger themes which come to fruition in later entries in the series. They went over and above what was necessary, and each edition felt just as impactful as the base game itself. Well done, Motive. You nailed it. Dead Space was a heavy game. Isaac stomped with intent across the Ishimura. The clomp of his boots echoed across corridors as he stamped necromorphs into mush. And the run was little more than a light jog for most characters. Moving forward through the series, Isaac became more and more athletic, able to perform rolls to evade attack and stomp repeatedly at a good clip. Remake falls closest in line with Dead Space 2, giving Isaac a boost to his movement and key actions without straying too far from what came before. DS2 seems to be the blueprint for the majority of changes when it comes to the base gameplay. The biggest influence outside of movement is kinesis. Just like that game, items snap to Isaac's grip and he releases them with devastating impact. Taking cues from the second entry isn't a bad thing. 2 took the ideas from 1 and improved them, adding random rods into the environment which were there solely to be thrown at approaching threats, pinning them to walls or knocking them back to create space. So seeing the same design philosophy brought back to the first entry, in my mind, was a perfect decision. And unlike DS2's implementation, it's not like every area is a stack of rods piled up in plain sight. Now, it's furniture you pull apart and items you rip directly off the walls. The environment has been designed to provide exactly what you need without making them seem out of place. To find success, you need to keep a keen eye on your surroundings, as everything can be a weapon, given the right circumstance. My first time throwing a fire extinguisher and seeing the volumetric fog billow out obscuring the battlefield as I walked through the exploded remains of my enemies was testament to the care Motive have taken to take what worked in subsequent titles and update it with modern design to stay rooted into the world while at the same time providing opportunities for the player to have freedom on how these battles unfold. Sticking to how Dead Space 2's mechanics have been retroactively fitted into DS1, opening new ways to play, let's move on to the layout of the Ishimura itself. With the power available thanks to the Frostbite engine and modern consoles, Motive were able to use the SSD to great effect by eliminating loading screens. This meant no longer having to wait inside elevators for what seemed like an eternity, but more importantly, it means the Ishimura itself could be designed to allow for true exploration. Using the map, you can see which rooms have been explored and which haven't. And if you want to travel from one side of the ship to the other, you can. You can either jump on board a tram, as long as you've unlocked the station, or jump out into the vacuum of space and zip about exploring brand new areas where you can find a host of upgrades, collectibles, or lore. What's mad is by adding this extra level of exploration, it's unintentionally the first time in the entire series that upgrading the oxygen meter feels worthwhile. I would lose myself flying about, taking in the scenery, and the only thing that would knock me out of this serenity was the laboured panic breathing of Isaac. So anything I could do to bask in the peace of my surroundings for a few seconds longer was worth all the nodes I could muster. By incorporating the same zero-gravity movement as Dead Space 2, and tweaking the environment to better suit this mobility, the Ishimura has been given an entire overhaul. Rooms can now be larger with multiple tiers, puzzles can be more complex, and combat in 0G is as great as it was in the second entry. No longer do we select where we are going and float towards it. Now we are in control. And that extra mobility is utilised not just in traversal, it fixes 2 of the major downsides with the original experience. The asteroid defense, and by extension, the final fight with Leviathan. Make no mistake about it, these sections in the original fucking sucked. Like your mother when the cracked rocks run dry sucks. So when I hesitantly walked across the open deck towards that bastard of a room, I was praying they'd binned it off. Little did I realise this section would be a high point of the overall game. You're still aiming at rocks, ensuring the hull integrity doesn't hit 0, but now you're flying about in 0G, with the added pressure of managing your air supply as you move from one location to another. It is a simple change, but one which incorporates core mechanics, and that's all it needed to be. It's no longer a half-baked minigame, it's tense, and more importantly, fun. The second stage of Leviathan adds to this by increasing the threat level. You're having to weave around the Leviathan's tentacles, dodge its projectiles, and target specific weak points. It's a proper boss fight, and one which posed a challenge on my first run. Now, if I had been tasked with remaking these sections, it would have gone like this.
Fuck! This shit!
Motive didn't take the easy way out. They reworked and reimagined them to make them engaging for the player, and that deserves huge praise. Now for this section, all I've done so far is talk through the parts of the franchise which have been retroactively fitted into Dead Space, and the changes that have been possible thanks to that. So let's change tack. Let's move it into the new additions Motive have included to deepen the gameplay experience. Let's talk weapons. Across the game, Isaac will find the same arsenal as the original, from the iconic plasma cutter to the Ripper and everything in between. How these weapons perform though, is anything but identical. My preferred choice has always been a plasma cutter, Ripper, and a pulse rifle, with a fourth being interchangeable. In Remake, what has always been a stable lineup has been shaken to the core. The weapons I've long scoffed at as unviable or too specific in their use to feature in my arsenal are now mainstays. The flamethrower is now a portable dragon. This thing absolutely melts anything that gets in its way, stun-locking enemies and controlling groups with ease. The contact beam charges quicker, and with its ammo being plentiful, it's efficient in pretty much any encounter. These guns have long been collecting dust over my many playthroughs, and now they have replaced the pulse rifle and the line gun to be guns which make Remake stand out from the past. It's like as if Motive looked at which guns are least used and reworked them to make them earn their place amongst the many iconic weapons in the franchise. And when you settle on which guns are your favourites, you now have a host of upgrades which can be found around the Ishimura to bring the smackdown to record heights. Do you want your shots to apply burn damage, have an extended mags, or super fast firing? Well, you better get out there and start searching. The impact they have on each gun, and the individual ways each weapon will change over time when more and more upgrades are applied, is staggering. It provides an extra incentive to backtrack, to go off the beaten path and find new goodies to improve your damage output, and there's never an upgrade that feels redundant. Hell, this even applies to stasis. By following side quests, you can cook up a prototype which shreds the flesh from a slowed enemy. You'd think with all this extra power, the game would be somehow easier, but it's not. Motive have taken a page from Resident Evil 2 Remake, utilising a behind-the-scenes game director which will artificially reduce or increase enemy health, damage output, and even spawns depending on how well the player is doing. It meant I was permanently on my toes, constantly walking a tightrope between feeling comfortable and feeling out of my depth. Now I can see why this feature may be a nightmare for speedrunners, but for playing this game how 99% of the population would, it ensures no playthrough will be identical. You never quite know where or when an enemy will burst out of an event, and that keeps the tension dialed up to 11. Speaking of tension, the breakers. Introduced early on, breakers are a key part of exploration aboard the Ishimura. They flow power from one location to another, from a spinning fan blade to a door, to allow for progression or to further side objectives. But as the game progresses, their implementation brings with it a Sophie's choice. Do you want to turn off the lights or the life support? Do you want to see the threats that will be around that next corner, or do you want to breathe? Which are you more afraid of? The choice is yours. What a fantastic idea, to give the player a choice on how the next encounter transpires, to raise the threat level and in turn bump up the fear factor. There's no way to get around these choices, you have to pick one, and each time they arose, I was left stunned.
Oh, beautiful.
To think this breaker system is really an update to the node doors used in the original. It's these little changes which have been given thought by Motive to upgrade what was already here as a base experience, to provide something new for returning fans, and root them into the core gameplay experience to deepen it. Motive have gone above and beyond in the gameplay department, fusing elements from 2 with brand new mechanics to broaden the original. For my money, it's the best the series has ever been in balancing all the different elements that make Dead Space, Dead Space. It's the same design philosophy as RE1 Remake. You deepen without taking away, provide additional challenge and complexity without ruining what worked so beautifully all those years ago. On its release, the launch of Dead Space was hit with many a controversy surrounding its presentation. Dropped frame rates and patchy resolution, in particular VRS, which stands for variable rate shading. This would make objects appear at lower resolutions, killing the immersion. But by the 31st of Jan, this feature was patched out of the consoles, and on PC, where the bulk of the complaints were, we were given the option to toggle its implementation on or off. Now, I bought the game on release, but didn't end up putting time into it till after these patches were provided, so I can only speak on my own experience in this section. Being a console diehard, I played through the game on PS5. Just like most games which release these days, I had a choice between dynamic resolution at 60 FPS or true 4K with ray tracing at 30. I am a sucker for a prettier game, and as the original trilogy targeted 30 FPS, the choice for me was obvious, and I was not disappointed. The game is a visual showcase. The ray tracing implementation is extraordinary, providing realistic shadows as the light from Isaac's weapons and the glow from his armor bounce off the hard metal surfaces. And when this is combined with volumetric fog which clings to walkways, you have no choice but to be fully immersed in your surroundings. The developers pre-release talked a lot about one feature which I felt was just a gimmick, but in reality, its implementation is superb. The peeling system. This is where damage dealt to an enemy is context driven, localized to that point, and enemies will behave differently depending on where this impacts. Up until now, in Dead Space, if an enemy took several shots to go down, it wasn't obvious where that damage was dealt until an appendage was removed. In Remake, you fire at an arm and it won't be removed immediately. Instead, the flesh will have been wiped out, exposing the bone and sinew before the second blow makes short work of it. The most satisfying way in seeing this peeling system in action is with the Force gun. Now allow me to give a presentation.
Remember me? Barry Scott! Over 1 million women around the UK are at it. They've replaced their multi-purpose cleaners with Silly Bang Universal Degreaser. Bang, and the dirt is gone!
Talk about satisfying. Using this for the first time and seeing a walking skeleton teetering towards me was mind-blowing. We've had plenty of games which have localized damaged models, but I haven't been this impressed since RE2 Remake. The attention to detail is incredible. It sells the impact, and there's something truly mesmerizing in seeing how each weapon brings its own flavor of destruction to the necromorphs. On the subject of character models, the entire cast has been modeled on their actors, and the mocap work, in particular with facial expressions, is sublime. Each actor's performance is translated to the game with near one-to-one perfection. There's no uncanny valley to be found here, no lifeless jaw wagging with vacant eyes. It's up there with the best the medium has to offer. Visually, as you can tell, I was blown away with Dead Space, but where the series has always prided itself is in the audio department, and in Remake, this has been taken to the next level. Dynamic sound which flares alongside the action is nothing new in 2023, but nowhere have I heard it be utilized to this extent. Sounds change and oscillate depending on the surfaces in a given area. 3D audio creates a feeling of panic as you hear scuttling and distant screams all around you. And as the action increases, the score rises to get your blood pumping. Now, what's truly revolutionary, and caught me off guard several times, is how this score will only increase when enemies are within view. Early on, I'd just taken out a host of enemies, and when the soundtrack faded, I relaxed. Little did I know a necromorph had snuck up behind me, and as I took a hit, I jumped out of pure shock, the soundtrack booming back into full swing as soon as I turned to look at what had caused this. It meant I couldn't rely on the soundtrack to know when I was safe. I had to be alert at all times. I was flicking Isaac around like I was overcome by marker-led psychosis. Never have I been so tense, so alert, jumping at shadows as I progressed towards the next goal. It forced me to slow down, to use the 3D audio to my advantage to ensure the Necros wouldn't get their drop on me again. The visuals and sound did exactly what they are meant to. They create an oppressive atmosphere, pinning me to the edge of my seat, and it kept me there throughout the entire experience. When I first heard that Dead Space was being remade, my initial thought was why? The original holds up incredibly well, so why bother going through the effort when a 4K port would do the job? After finishing the game, I couldn't have been more wrong. Motive have knocked it out of the park, managing to improve the original in every conceivable way. The visuals and sound are captivating. The gameplay changes and additional lore on offer are exceptional. It's a game where the source material has been treated with care and reverence, retaining everything that made it a breath of fresh air in 2008, while fixing its shortcomings with new mechanics and years of sheer progress in the medium of video gaming. Motive have gone above and beyond with this remake, deepening the game, providing a true vision of Dead Space's potential. It's not just an incredible remake, it's an incredible game, and in my mind, it's the best way to experience the story of the Ishimura. Thanks to this, there is no reason to ever go back to the 2008 original. Remake improves on it in every conceivable way, and that's what a remake should be. It's the reason why Resident Evil Remake is heralded as the best remake all these years later, and now it has a competitor. I believe in what Motive have achieved here, and if this is the beginning of a remake trilogy, I can't wait to see what they do with the rest of the series. If you haven't played Motive's Dead Space by now, I implore you to put the time aside and see the game through. You'll be experiencing one of the best horror titles of all time, and certainly one of, if not, the best remake ever made. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, then put a like on it and consider subscribing for more survival horror content. Up next on the channel, I'll be returning to Resident Evil 4 RE8 VR, before I delve into Resident Evil DLC from across the franchise on the run-up to RE4 VR and the rumoured Separate Ways expansion. If you're still craving a bit more from me, consider checking out my podcast, In PS We Trust. It's a PlayStation podcast with me and my co-host discuss the latest news, rumours and hype for all things PlayStation, and of course, survival horror. I'll leave links in the description. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya.